Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth, here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. The snow fell heavily, muffling the world in an eerie silence. Clara gripped the wheel of her old car as she drove through the dense forest. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, and her phone had no signal. All she had was an old map, a vague memory of winding roads, and a sinking feeling in her chest. She didn't want to be here. She hadn't wanted to come back to this town since she left it behind years ago. The cabin came into view, a shadowy figure against the white blanket of snow. Clara parked the car, the engine's hum fading into the quiet of the woods. She stepped out, shivering as the cold bit at her skin. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, its windows dark and its wooden structure weathered by time. She hesitated at the door, the key shaking in her hand. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and dust. Her childhood memories rushed back. Christmas mornings by the fireplace, her mother humming carols in the kitchen, and the quiet whispers of things she couldn't explain. The silence was oppressive. Clara unpacked quickly, trying to shake off the unease. But then she noticed something. On the kitchen table lay a single envelope, its edges yellowed with age. Her name was written on it in her mother's handwriting. Clara, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. There's something I need to tell you about the cabin, about our family. You must not ignore the light. Clara frowned, her heart pounding. She flipped the paper over, but there was nothing more. What light? She glanced out the window, but everything was dark except for the faint moonlight reflecting off the snow. As the night deepened, Clara felt a strange pull to stay awake. She sat by the fireplace, her mother's note on the table beside her. The words lingered in her mind, refusing to leave her in peace. Then she saw it. A faint glow in the distance, just beyond the edge of the woods. It wasn't a lantern or a car's headlights. It was a soft, pulsing light that seemed alive, calling to her. Her breath hitched. She locked the door and drew the curtains, trying to block it out. But even behind closed eyes, she could feel its presence, its rhythm matching the thumping of her heart. Clara didn't sleep that night. Morning came, but the light didn't fade. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the brightness. The glow seemed to hover over the ground, leading into the forest. Against her better judgment, she followed it. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The light danced ahead, just out of reach, pulling her further into the unknown. Finally, she reached a clearing. In the center stood a house she didn't recognize, though it looked ancient, like it had been standing there for centuries. The light came from within, streaming out through cracks in the wooden walls. The door creaked open on its own. Clara's pulse quickened, but her feet moved forward as if guided by an invisible force. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, but the light was everywhere, illuminating every corner. Then she saw them, figures moving in the glow, shadows that flickered like firelight. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely otherworldly either. They moved with purpose, whispering words she couldn't understand. One of them turned to her, its face indistinct yet horrifyingly familiar. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure extended a hand, its fingers long and gnarled. "You're not supposed to be here," it said, its voice echoing in her mind. Clara stumbled back, her legs shaking. "What is this place?" she managed to ask. The figure tilted its head, its form shimmering like heat waves. "You already know." A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. She was 8 years old, playing near the woods. Her mother had called her back, her voice panicked. That night, the light had appeared for the first time, and Clara had been too young to understand what it meant. Now, standing in this strange house, she felt the weight of years of denial and forgotten warnings. The figure stepped closer, and Clara turned to run, but the door slammed shut before she could reach it. "You can't leave," the figure said. "Not yet." The light grew brighter, enveloping her in its glow. Clara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence. The light faded slowly, leaving Clara kneeling on the cold wooden floor of the house. Her head throbbed and her vision blurred. When she opened her eyes, the room looked different. The walls were no longer cracked and aged. They gleamed as if freshly polished. The air carried a strange warmth, the scent of burning candles and something faintly sweet, like mulled wine. Voices echoed softly, though she couldn't see anyone. Clara stood, her legs trembling, and turned toward the source of the sound. A faint hum of laughter and chatter filled the air. It came from behind a door that hadn't been there moments ago. Hesitating, Clara placed her hand on the ornate brass handle. The metal was unnaturally warm, as if someone had been holding it moments before. She pushed it open. The sight before her stole her breath. A lavish Christmas party was underway. The room was impossibly large, stretching farther than the house should allow. A massive chandelier hung overhead, its crystals sparkling with a golden glow. Dozens of people were gathered, dressed in clothing from another time. Women wore floor-length gowns adorned with lace and jewels, while men were dressed in tailored suits and vests. No one seemed to notice Clara standing in the doorway, her jeans and parka starkly out of place. She took a tentative step inside, her boots sinking into a plush crimson carpet. The hum of the crowd grew louder, a symphony of laughter and whispers that felt almost too perfect. She tried to speak, to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. As she moved deeper into the room, she felt the eyes of the crowd slowly turn toward her. One by one, the conversation stopped and the laughter faded. Clara froze under their gaze. Their faces were unsettlingly blank, too perfect, too still, as if painted onto masks. A man near the fireplace stepped forward, his movements unnaturally smooth. His face broke into a wide, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome, Clara," he said, his voice calm but heavy with something unspoken. Her blood ran cold. "How do you know my name?" The man's smile widened. "You've always been expected. We've been waiting for you." Clara took a step back, her heart pounding. "I don't know who you are or what this is, but I'm leaving." The man tilted his head, amused. "Leaving? My dear, no one leaves. You're part of this now, just like the rest of us." As he gestured to the crowd, something about their faces began to shift. The perfection melted away, revealing pale, hollowed features, eyes sunken and lifeless. They weren't people, they were something else entirely. Clara's breath came in short gasps. She turned to run, but the door she had entered through was gone. In its place was a wall, smooth and unbroken. "Stay," the man said softly, his tone dripping with menace. "Enjoy the festivities. After all, it's tradition." A hand brushed her shoulder, cold as ice. She whipped around to see a woman with long dark hair and a smile that didn't belong on any human face. The woman held out a glass of something dark red. "Drink," she said, her voice a soft melody. "You must toast with us." Clara shoved the glass away, her heart racing. "I don't belong here." The crowd began to close in, their movements slow but deliberate. Their voices overlapped in a haunting chant, a language Clara didn't understand. The golden glow of the chandelier dimmed, replaced by an ominous red hue that bathed the room in shadows. Panic surged through her. Clara grabbed a nearby candelabra and swung it wildly, forcing the figures to step back. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any escape. In the corner, she spotted a staircase spiraling upward. Without hesitation, she bolted toward it. The crowd's chant grew louder, their voices echoing in her ears. She raced up the stairs, her legs burning with the effort. The steps seemed endless, twisting higher and higher, until she burst through a door at the top. She was outside. But it wasn't the forest she had come from. Instead, she stood in a snow-covered courtyard surrounded by tall, looming walls. The sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds, broken only by streaks of crimson lightning. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the silence was broken only by a faint, distant bell tolling a slow, mournful chime. Clara stumbled forward, her breath visible in the frigid air. She didn't know where she was or how she had gotten here, but one thing was clear: she wasn't alone. In the center of the courtyard stood a figure cloaked in black, its face obscured by a hood. It held a lantern that emitted the same pulsating light she had followed into the forest. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at Clara. "You've seen too much," it said in a voice that was neither male nor female, but something in between, something otherworldly. "What do you want from me?" Clara shouted, her voice cracking. The figure stepped closer, the snow beneath it undisturbed by its movement. "This isn't about what I want. It's about what you owe." Clara's mind raced. What could she possibly owe to something like this? "I don't understand," she pleaded. The figure stopped just a few feet away. "You will?" The light from the lantern intensified, flooding the courtyard and consuming everything in its path. Clara screamed as the world dissolved into blinding whiteness. When the light finally receded, she found herself back in the cabin, sitting by the fireplace. The room was quiet, the glow of the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, charged with the same energy she had felt in the house and the courtyard. On the table in front of her was the same glass the woman had offered her at the party, filled to the brim with dark red liquid. Her hands trembled as she reached for the glass. This time she had no choice. Clara's fingers hovered over the glass. The dark liquid swirled inside, almost beckoning her. Her mind screamed at her to stay away, but her body betrayed her. She had been drawn into this nightmare, and there was no escaping it now. Slowly, she lifted the glass to her lips. As the liquid touched her tongue, a burning sensation spread through her throat, searing its way down to her stomach. It was the taste of something ancient, something alive. The room around her seemed to ripple and blur. The flames in the fireplace flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows that twisted and stretched across the walls. Then the voices returned. Soft at first, like whispers in the wind, but growing louder, clearer, until they filled the entire room. Clara pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew stronger. The whispers weren't just words. They were feelings, emotions, memories that weren't hers, all mingling together in a cacophony of voices. "You shouldn't have come back," one voice whispered. "You can't leave now." Clara's heart raced. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the overwhelming chorus. The temperature dropped, the warmth from the fire fading as the cold seeped in, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. Her breath came out in clouds, each exhale visible in the air. The shadows seemed to move now, inching closer to her, their shapes twisting into monstrous forms. The door to the cabin creaked open and Clara's pulse spiked. She spun around, but no one was there. Yet the door remained open, an invitation or perhaps a command. She had no choice. The house had consumed her already. With a deep breath, Clara stepped outside, the cold biting at her skin. The snow beneath her feet crunched sharply as she walked toward the edge of the woods. The pulsating light was back, brighter this time, like a beacon calling her forward. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to pull her back. She stumbled, her feet slipping on the ice, but she couldn't stop. The light was too powerful, its pull irresistible. She reached the clearing where the house stood, its silhouette looming against the night sky. It looked different now, more real, more solid, as if it had grown from the earth itself. The windows glowed with the same soft light, inviting her inside. As she approached the door, she heard the same haunting voices from before. They spoke in unison, their tone pleading and demanding at the same time. "Enter." Clara hesitated. She knew she had to. It wasn't a choice anymore, it was her fate. She pushed the door open, and the moment she stepped inside, the temperature dropped even further. The warmth she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by an oppressive, freezing chill that seeped into her bones. The walls seemed to close in on her, the space growing tighter with every passing second. In the center of the room stood the figure from before, the one cloaked in black. This time it didn't speak. Instead, it gestured toward a chair placed in the center of the room, its back to the glowing fireplace. Clara could feel its gaze on her, cold and unyielding. "Sit." Her legs trembled as she moved to the chair, sitting down slowly, her heart pounding. The room was silent now, save for the crackling of the fire. Then the figure moved closer, its form shifting in the shadows. It reached out, placing a cold hand on her shoulder. "You belong to us now," it said, its voice soft yet chilling. Clara shook her head. "No, I won't stay." The figure's face remained hidden, but Clara could feel the power radiating from it, a presence that seemed to fill the entire room. The air grew heavier, and the shadows twisted more violently around her. "You don't have a choice," the figure said again, its voice now filled with dark finality. "You never did." The light from the fireplace flickered, casting strange, twisted shapes on the walls. Clara's vision blurred again, her thoughts growing hazy. The whispers returned, this time louder than ever, each word sharp and insistent. "Drink." The glass appeared before her again, the dark liquid still swirling inside, its surface catching the firelight. Clara's hands shook as she reached for it. She had no choice now, no way to escape. As the glass touched her lips once more, the room seemed to spin. The firelight dimmed, and the shadows around her deepened. Everything around her faded into darkness. The last thing Clara saw before everything went black was the figure, standing tall and still, its presence overwhelming. "You are ours now," it whispered, "and the light will never fade." Clara woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness around her was suffocating, the air thick with a strange, musty scent that made her stomach churn. She gasped, sitting up quickly, her surroundings unfamiliar and cold. The walls around her were rough stone, damp with age. Her hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of the floor. "Where am I?" Her mind raced, but the memory of the previous events was hazy, like a dream she couldn't quite shake. The light, the party, the figure in the black cloak, the whispers. Had it all been real, or was she still trapped in some twisted nightmare? She tried to stand, but her legs felt weak, as though the weight of the world had settled in them. Clara stumbled to her feet, trying to steady herself. The walls felt oppressive, closing in on her. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but it remained blurry, the darkness pressing down from every corner. Suddenly, a door creaked open behind her and Clara froze. She didn't need to turn around to know who was there. The figure in black. It stepped into the room, its presence making the air grow even colder. The lantern it carried flickered with an unnatural, sickly glow, casting long, distorting shadows on the stone walls. The figure's face remained hidden in the folds of its cloak, but Clara could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, locking onto her. "You've woken up," the figure said, its voice a low, rasping whisper. Clara backed away instinctively, her mind racing for a way out, but the room had no windows, no exits other than the door that the figure now blocked. "What do you want from me?" she choked out. Her voice was raw, barely more than a whisper herself, but the words carried the weight of fear and desperation. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her question. "You've already been marked. You don't understand yet, but you will. You will learn soon enough what it means to belong to us." Clara's stomach twisted in dread. "Belong? I'm not part of whatever this is. I just want to leave." The figure remained silent for a long moment, the flickering light casting an eerie glow on the stone walls as the shadows seemed to grow longer, deeper. Then it stepped forward, and Clara took an involuntary step back, her pulse quickening. "You will leave," the figure said softly. "But you will never be the same. You will always be ours, whether you like it or not." Clara's mind raced. What did it mean? What was this thing, and why was it so insistent that she was a part of it now? She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "I don't belong to anyone," Clara said, her voice trembling but defiant. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing the air just in front of her. "Not yet, perhaps. But in time you will come to understand." Before Clara could respond, the figure turned and began to walk toward the door. As it reached the threshold, it paused, its voice floating back to her. "Follow the light, Clara. It's always waiting. And if you ever turn away from it, you will never escape." With that, the figure disappeared through the doorway, leaving Clara alone in the cold, oppressive darkness. She stood there, trembling, the weight of its words settling over her like a thick fog. The light. She had seen it before, the pulsing, inviting glow. She knew what it wanted her to do. She had followed it once already. But now it felt different. It felt dangerous. Clara wasn't sure how much longer she could stand this place, this nightmare. Every step she took felt like a step closer to something terrible, something beyond her control. She was caught in a web of fear, and the threads were tightening with every passing second. But the light, it was still out there somewhere. She knew deep down that it was calling to her, drawing her in like a moth to a flame. She couldn't ignore it. Not now. With a heavy heart, Clara turned toward the door. She had no choice but to follow. As she stepped into the corridor, the walls around her seemed to shift, twisting and warping. The flickering light in the distance was unmistakable now, just ahead, beckoning her forward. She hesitated, but only for a moment. The whispers returned, soft at first, but growing louder with every step. They spoke her name, calling her, urging her to come closer. The light pulsed once more, and Clara felt herself moving forward, her feet carrying her against her will. But then something strange happened. The light flickered, dimmed for a split second, and in that brief instant, Clara saw it. The truth. The figure in black had not been lying. She wasn't supposed to be here. This place, this nightmare, it was her destiny. Her bloodline had bound her to this cursed existence. She was the key, the missing piece of the puzzle, and there was no escaping it. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. She wasn't just a visitor to this world of shadows and fear. She was part of it, and there was no way out. Clara reached the source of the light, her heart pounding in her ears. The glowing orb hovered in front of her, its glow now overpowering, casting everything around her in a brilliant, blinding light. Before she could touch it, the figure in black appeared again, standing in the doorway. Its cold, lifeless eyes were fixed on her. "Do you see now?" it whispered. "You are ours, Clara. And this is your fate." With that, the light surged forward, engulfing her entirely. Clara's senses were overwhelmed as the light surrounded her, blinding her. The warmth from the glow felt suffocating, a heat that clawed at her skin like fire. She wanted to scream, to pull away, but her body refused to move. She was trapped, suspended in the intensity of the light, her mind spiraling in chaos. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The warmth turned to cold, the brightness faded into the oppressive darkness once more. Clara blinked, struggling to focus, but everything around her was distorted, a blurry haze of shadows and empty space. She was no longer in the corridor. Her heart raced as she took in her new surroundings. The room was vast, stretching endlessly in all directions, the walls made of ancient, cracked stone. The ceiling was impossibly high, far above her, lost in the black void above. There was no light here, no warmth. Only the bitter chill that seeped into her bones, making every movement feel heavier. She looked around, panic clawing at her chest. "Where am I?" she whispered, the sound of her voice swallowed by the thick silence. Then the whispers returned. They were louder now, as if they were inside her head, each voice overlapping the other, creating a constant, maddening hum. "Clara," they murmured. "Clara, you can't escape. You've already made your choice." Clara staggered backward, her breath shallow as she pressed her hands against the cold stone wall. "No," she gasped, trying to force the words past the lump in her throat. This isn't real." But deep down she knew it was. She could feel it in the air, in the very stones beneath her feet. This place, this nightmare, it was real. The whispers didn't stop. They only grew more insistent, more frantic, until they became a roar in her ears, drowning out all sense of reason. Clara dropped to her knees, her hands clutching her head in desperation. "Please, stop," she begged, but the voices didn't listen. And then, suddenly they went silent. The absence of sound was worse than the noise. Clara sat there, frozen in the cold, the emptiness pressing in on her from all sides. She didn't know how long she stayed like that, lost in the void, but when she finally stood up, it felt as though the room itself was shifting. The walls seemed to close in on her, the distance between the cracked stones growing smaller with each passing second. She had to move. With shaky legs, Clara pushed herself to her feet and stumbled forward, each step echoing in the silence. But no matter how far she walked, the room seemed to stretch endlessly, as if it had no end, no exit. It was as though she was walking in circles, each turn bringing her back to where she started. The oppressive darkness made it difficult to see, but in the distance, just beyond her reach, Clara thought she saw a faint flicker of light. A beacon. Her breath caught in her throat as she quickened her pace, her eyes fixed on the light. It was faint, but it was real. The same beckoning, pulsing light she had seen before, the one that had drawn her into this nightmare. Clara's hands reached out toward it, desperate for something familiar, something she could cling to. The closer she got, the more the light seemed to grow, until it was as though it was all that existed in this vast, empty space. And then it vanished. Clara froze. Her heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be gone. She had seen it. She had almost touched it. Her pulse raced, and she felt a surge of panic clawing at her chest. Where had it gone? What was happening? Clara? The voice was soft, but it carried with an unnatural weight, a presence that seemed to fill the entire room. Clara spun around, her body tensing at the sound. Standing in the distance, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure in black. The figure that had haunted her every step. "You," Clara's voice cracked, fear rising in her throat. "Why won't you leave me alone?" The figure stepped forward, its movements deliberate, slow, like the ticking of a clock counting down the time left before it reached her. "You can't escape, Clara," it said, its voice cold and hollow. "You belong to us now. There is no leaving." Clara backed away, her mind racing for an escape. She turned around, trying to find any hint of the light again, but it was gone. The figure was drawing closer, its dark cloak billowing with each step. "You're wrong?" Clara shouted, her voice shaky but defiant. "I won't stay. I won't let you control me." The figure didn't respond. It merely continued to advance, its presence growing more suffocating with every step. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps, and her legs felt like lead. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. With every step the figure took, the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. The room around her was no longer just a void, it was a prison. A suffocating, inescapable prison. "I don't belong here," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't belong to you." The figure stopped, standing just inches from her. Its cold hand reached out, brushing her cheek, sending a chill through her that froze her very soul. "You do," it whispered. "And you always will." The darkness around her pressed in tighter, suffocating her, and Clara's knees buckled beneath her, her body trembling with the weight of the realization. There was no escape. And then, just as the figure reached for her, something shifted. A crack in the darkness, a break in the suffocating grip that held her. The light returned. But this time it wasn't an invitation. It wasn't beckoning her. It was the last hope she had. Clara's eyes widened as she saw the light grow brighter, the figure's presence faltering under its power. She didn't hesitate. She ran. With every step, the light grew stronger, the darkness retreating as if it had no power against it. Clara pushed herself forward, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. The figure screamed, a sound so filled with rage and anguish that it sent chills down her spine. But Clara didn't look back. She couldn't. She just ran toward the light, toward the only chance she had left to escape. With every step, the darkness shrank, the figure's voice fading, until finally Clara burst through. She emerged into the light, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had escaped, but as she looked around, she realized she wasn't free. She was still in the house. But now she knew the truth. The house wasn't just a building. It was a prison. And it was always watching, always waiting. And no matter how far she ran, it would always find her. Because Clara wasn't just a visitor. She was part of it. And there was no escaping her fate. Clara stood still, her breath shallow, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She had escaped, hadn't she? The light, the figure in black, all of it had seemed like the final act in some twisted game. But now, as she scanned the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a grave mistake. The room around her was eerily still, almost as if time had frozen. There was no sound, no movement, only an oppressive silence that gnawed at her nerves. The walls, though slightly different in texture, still held that same haunting, familiar presence. Felt wrong. She stepped forward cautiously, every footfall echoing too loudly in the silence. The floor beneath her felt colder now, a biting chill seeping through her shoes as though the house itself was alive, breathing with an unholy pulse. Clara's gaze darted around, searching for something, anything, that would make sense of the strange place she found herself in. And then she saw it. A doorway. It was not the same door she had come through earlier, but it was a door nonetheless. The edges of the frame were carved with intricate patterns, their meaning lost to time. The wood seemed to shift in the dim light, as though the doorway itself was waiting for her. Clara hesitated, the weight of the situation settling in. She had no idea where this door would lead, but what other choice did she have? The figure in black was still out there, somewhere. Watching. Waiting. And no matter how far she ran, she couldn't outrun the darkness. Her pulse quickened as she approached the door, her fingers brushing against the cold, uneven surface of the wood. For a brief moment, she considered turning back, staying in the relative safety of the room she had just entered. But the thought of being trapped here, in this never-ending nightmare, was far worse than the uncertainty that lay beyond that door. With a deep breath, Clara pushed the door open. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The light from the room behind her barely illuminated the corridor beyond, where shadows clung to the walls like sinister creatures. The hallway stretched out, far longer than it should have been, as if it curved and twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Clara stepped into the hallway, her footsteps cautious. She could feel the walls closing in, the air growing colder with each passing second. The whispers were back, more persistent now, their voices laced with malice. "Clara, come closer." She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she quickened her pace, the sound of the whispers growing louder, more urgent. Her head snapped to the side as she noticed something strange. There were shadows, figures, barely visible, flitting just out of her peripheral vision. They moved too fast to fully make out, but Clara felt their eyes on her, cold and unblinking. Fear gripped her heart, but she pressed on. There was no going back now. Suddenly the hallway forked. A sharp turn to the left and another to the right. Clara stopped dead in her tracks, uncertainty flooding her mind. Which path should she take? She glanced down both corridors. To the left, the hallway stretched dark and ominous, the walls seeming to curve inward, suffocating. To the right, there was a flicker of light, just a glimpse, but it was enough to draw her attention. Without thinking, Clara chose the path to the right, her legs carrying her forward despite the uncertainty in her chest. The closer she got to the light, the more it pulsed, the warmth beckoning her like the glow of a dying star. But as she neared, the light flickered and went out. Clara stumbled, her heart pounding in her ears. She reached out, her fingers brushing the empty space where the light had been. "Don't." The voice came from behind her. Clara spun around, her eyes wide with terror. Standing at the end of the hallway only a few feet away was the figure in black. It hadn't followed her. It had been there, waiting as if it knew exactly where she would go. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. The darkness around her seemed to close in, tightening its grip. "You thought you could escape?" the figure whispered, its voice like 1,000 nails scraping across stone. "You thought you could run? There is nowhere left to go." Clara's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Please," she gasped, her voice a fragile whisper. "Please, I don't want this. I just want to go home. I don't belong here." The figure tilted its head, its face hidden in the folds of its cloak. "Home?" it echoed. "There is no home for you. You belong here with us. This is your place now. You are one of us whether you accept it or not." Clara's mind spun in chaos. She felt trapped in a web of lies, of terror, of something far worse than she had imagined. She had been marked. She had made a choice long ago, whether she had known it or not. And now there was no turning back. But even as the darkness threatened to consume her, something stirred within Clara, a small flicker of defiance. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you're wrong." The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "There is no escape, Clara. You will never be free." Clara took a shaky breath. Her eyes flicked to the door behind the figure, the one she had entered through. There was a faint trace of light coming from it, just a sliver, a promise. With trembling hands, Clara pushed herself to her feet. She could feel the eyes of the figure on her, its cold gaze burning into her back as she took a step, then another. "No," she said again, louder this time. "I won't stay." The figure's hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a strength that felt unnatural. Clara gasped, the grip cold as ice. The figure's face was still hidden in shadow, but she could feel its presence looming over her, threatening to crush her. "You are ours," it whispered, its voice chilling. "There is no escaping the dark." With every ounce of strength left in her, Clara wrenched her arm from the figure's grasp. She spun, running with everything she had, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But as she ran, the whispers returned, louder now, more frantic. "Clara?" It was the same voice, the figure. And this time she knew it wasn't just calling her. It was warning her. The darkness was closing in, and it would not let her go. But Clara wasn't ready to give up yet. Not while she still had a chance. She had to keep running. She had to keep fighting. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as her legs pumped harder, carrying her through the endless hallways that seemed to stretch farther the more she ran. The walls closed in, pressing on her from all sides as the light ahead of her flickered in and out like a dying heartbeat. The whispers followed her, now a deafening chorus, their words cutting through her thoughts, tearing at her sanity. "Clara?" Each whisper felt like a heavy weight on her chest, as though the voices were pulling at her, dragging her back into the darkness. The figure's words echoed in her mind, haunting her. "Asterisk, you belong here. There is no escape, asterisk." But Clara wouldn't stop. She couldn't stop. The corridor stretched on, its end never seeming to come closer. No matter how fast she ran, no matter how hard she pushed, the walls remained the same, cold, unyielding, oppressive. She could hear the figure's footsteps behind her now, slow, deliberate, matching her pace. It was toying with her, allowing her to think she could escape before it would finally reach her, consuming her with its darkness. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a large room, a vast chamber filled with ancient, crumbling furniture. The air felt colder here, thicker, as if the room itself was alive with malevolent intent. The light from the corridor behind her flickered one last time before fading completely, leaving her in the oppressive blackness of the room. Clara stopped, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her eyes strained against the dark, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but there was nothing to see. The room seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, the shadows lurking just out of her sight. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Clara, Clara, why are you running?" She turned around, her eyes wide with fear, but the room was empty. No figure, no presence, just the silence. Where did it go? She had to keep moving. The uncertainty gnawed at her, pulling her forward. As her footsteps echoed through the room, she felt a strange pull toward the farthest corner. It was almost magnetic, as if something was drawing her there, urging her forward. With a final glance over her shoulder, Clara stepped forward, the sound of her feet against the floor echoing through the vast emptiness. The room stretched out, impossibly large, but Clara didn't care anymore. She had to get to that corner. It was as if a sense of fate was guiding her, pushing her toward whatever awaited her. As she approached the corner, the air seemed to thicken, the temperature plummeting further into an unholy cold. Her breath escaped invisible clouds, but she didn't stop. There, just beyond her reach, stood a mirror. It was old, the glass cracked, the frame ornate but worn. It reflected nothing but a deep, swirling blackness that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Clara reached out, her trembling hand brushing against the cold surface of the mirror. A chill shot up her arm, and she recoiled instinctively, her heart hammering in her chest. But then something strange happened. The mirror rippled as though it were alive, the surface shifting in a way that shouldn't be possible. She stared, mesmerized, as the reflection began to change. Slowly, the blackness within the mirror seemed to take form. A shape, a figure. It was her. At first, Clara thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But as she watched, the reflection of herself in the mirror began to move on its own. Her mirrored self smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that didn't belong on her face. Clara took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real. This isn't." But her reflection didn't listen. It stepped forward, its eyes hollow, black, and empty. The smile widened as it raised a hand, its fingers long and bony, reaching out to her. Clara stumbled backward, her heart racing. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She turned and ran. But no matter where she went, the mirror was always there. Every corner, every step she took, it followed her. The reflection of her twisted self grinning, chasing her. Panic surged in her chest as she ran faster, her legs burning, but the figure in the mirror was always just behind her, its movements unnatural, gliding across the room without effort. Her mind raced. What was this? What was happening? The mirror had become more than just a reflection. It had become a prison. A window into something darker, something that wanted to claim her. She was running in circles, trapped in this nightmare. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, nothing was real anymore. Everything was a reflection. The cold breath of the figure in the mirror brushed against her neck. And then she saw it. A doorway just ahead. A single door that seemed different from all the others. It was glowing, faintly, with a soft, almost welcoming light. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran toward it, her body moving faster than she thought possible. The mirror, her reflection, tried to reach out, its fingers inches from her skin. But she was closer to the door now. Closer. And then, just as her fingers touched the handle, she heard the voice, low, menacing, and filled with finality. "Clara, you can't leave." The door flew open before she could respond, and she stepped through, the darkness swallowing her whole. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Clara in another room. She was no longer running. She was trapped. The room was small, suffocating, with only one window, a high, narrow slit that barely let any light through. Clara's eyes darted around the space, her breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no exit, no escape. She had nowhere to go. Her heart pounded in her chest as she collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with fear. And then, from the farthest corner of the room, a voice whispered, "Clara?" It was the same voice, the same figure. But this time it wasn't just behind her. It was inside her head. She felt it, the weight, the pull. The darkness creeping in, wrapping itself around her mind. And Clara realized then that she hadn't escaped. She had been walking into it, all along. Clara's chest heaved as she sat against the cold wall, the reality of her situation beginning to sink in. She had been running, no fleeing, but there had been no escape. Each room, each door had only led to more of the same, a maddening spiral into a darkness she could no longer avoid. The whispers were louder now, swirling around her head like a constant buzz in her ears. She clutched her head, willing the sound to stop, but it only grew louder, closer, more insistent. "Clara?" She froze. The voice was inside her mind now, filling the void where her thoughts used to be. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command, a demand pulling her into the abyss. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and she struggled to breathe as if the air itself had thickened, becoming heavier with each passing second. She stood up, her legs unsteady, but she refused to give in. There had to be a way out. There had to be something. Her eyes darted around the room again, scanning every inch for some clue, some escape. The narrow window was her only chance, but it was so high, far out of reach. And then her gaze fell on the walls. They were covered in something dark, smeared markings, almost like scratches or gouges, as though something had clawed its way through them. Something or someone. Her pulse quickened. What if the walls themselves were alive? What if they were waiting for her to make a mistake, to let her guard down? The thought sent a chill through her bones. She turned away from the walls, trying not to let her mind wander back to the terrifying possibilities. The room was stifling. The silence between the whispers was unbearable. She had to find a way to silence them. Clara's gaze moved to the far corner of the room, where something dark was lying in the shadows. A lump, covered by what looked like an old, tattered cloth. It hadn't been there before. Her heart skipped a beat. Should she check it? Should she avoid it? Every part of her screamed to stay away, but her curiosity, and perhaps a desperate need for answers, pushed her forward. She didn't want to, but she couldn't resist. With shaking hands, she reached toward the lump. She hesitated for a moment, but then her fingers touched the cloth, cold and damp to the touch. Slowly, she lifted it, her heart racing as she revealed what lay beneath. A body. Not just any body. It was the body of a woman, motionless, pale, and twisted at an unnatural angle. Her face was contorted in a grotesque expression of horror, eyes wide open as if frozen in fear. Clara gasped, stumbling backward, nearly falling to the floor. The figure in the mirror, had it been her all along? Was this what the darkness had been showing her? Was this her fate? "No, this can't be happening," Clara whispered, her breath ragged. She wiped the cold sweat from her brow, her mind racing. The room seemed to pulse with a sickening energy. The whispers, now deafening, seemed to come from all directions. They were speaking to her, urging her to look closer, to understand. "Asterisk, you know her. You've always known her, asterisk." Clara shook her head, trying to block the voices out, but they only grew louder. "Asterisk, it's you. You are her, asterisk." A cold realization washed over Clara as her gaze fell to the woman's lifeless hand. In her palm was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, its edges frayed. She reached forward, trembling, and took the paper, unfolding it slowly. The words scrawled on it were barely legible, written in a hurried, frantic hand. Asterisk, it was always you. Always the one they wanted. Always the one they chose. You can't run from your destiny. Asterisk. Clara's stomach churned as she read the message again, a sickening sense of dread pooling in the pit of her stomach. This was it. This was the answer. But the question remained, what did it mean? She clutched the paper in her hand, the weight of the words sinking into her very soul. The whispers were silent now, as if they were waiting for her to understand. But Clara wasn't sure if she could. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. With trembling hands, she folded the paper again, her mind racing. This was her fate, wasn't it? She was stuck. There was no escape from the house. There was no escape from the whispers, from the darkness, from the horror that had already claimed her. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she sank to her knees, her heart breaking under the crushing weight of her realization. She had tried to fight. She had tried to run. But in the end, it hadn't mattered. She was already a part of it. And no matter how hard she fought, no matter how far she ran, she would never escape. The walls around her began to close in, the darkness consuming everything. The whispers once again began to echo in her mind. Asterisk, you're ours now, Clara. There is no going back, asterisk. And as the darkness swallowed her whole, Clara realized the cruel truth. She had never been running from the house. She had been running from herself. And now there was no one left to run to. In the end, it was only the house, the shadows, and her, forever. Story 2. The snow was falling heavier than it had in years. Each flake landed like a quiet warning, blanketing the town in an eerie stillness. Elena stood by the frosted window, her breath fogging up the glass as she stared at the Christmas tree in the middle of the room. Something about it felt off. It wasn't the way it leaned slightly to the left, nor the odd hum that seemed to come from nowhere when she plugged in the lights. It was the ornaments. There was one in particular, a small hand-carved angel. Its eyes seemed to follow her every move, and though it hung lifelessly on a branch, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. Elena, her younger brother Jamie called from the hallway, "Mom says to bring the box of decorations up." She hesitated. "I'll do it later," she replied, her voice unusually sharp. Jamie didn't argue, he rarely did anymore. That night, as the family gathered to decorate the tree, the mood was lighter. They laughed, shared memories, and even sang a carol or two. But Elena couldn't relax. The angel ornament felt like it was watching her. By the time the last decoration was hung, the tree looked stunning, perfect even. But as everyone went to bed, leaving the room in darkness save for the glow of the lights, Elena stayed behind. She couldn't stop staring at that angel. Its carved mouth seemed to curl just slightly, a hint of a smile that hadn't been there before. She blinked. Art. When her eyes opened, the smile was gone. "Elena," her mother's voice startled her. "Why are you still up?" "I thought I saw something," she whispered, unable to explain the chill running down her spine. "It's just a tree," her mother said, smiling softly. "Come on, you've had a long day." But as they walked upstairs, Elena could have sworn she heard the faintest sound, a soft, rasping whisper. "Don't let her see you." She froze mid-step. "What's wrong?" her mom asked, turning back. "Nothing," Elena lied, her heart racing. That night, sleep didn't come easily. And when it did, it was filled with dreams of the angel's wooden face, twisted and alive. The next morning, things got worse. The next morning, Elena woke up with a jolt. For a moment, she wasn't sure what had startled her, until she realized the soft hum she had heard the day before wasn't coming from the lights anymore. It was inside her room. She sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The noise was faint, barely there, but it was unmistakable. "Elena?" Jamie's small voice came from the other side of the door. She exhaled, feeling a rush of relief. "Yeah, what is it? Can I come in?" She opened the door to find Jamie clutching his favorite blanket, his face pale. "I can't sleep," he mumbled, looking over his shoulder nervously. "Why not?" "There's someone downstairs." Elena's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, someone?" "I heard footsteps," Jamie whispered, his voice trembling. And laughing." "Laughing?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. Jamie nodded. She grabbed the baseball bat from beside her bed, a leftover from their old house, and motioned for Jamie to stay behind her. They crept down the staircase together, the faint twinkle of the Christmas tree lights casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. But when they reached the bottom, the living room was empty. The tree stood exactly as they'd left it, its ornaments shimmering innocently. "Elena, look," Jamie said, tugging on her sleeve. She followed his gaze and froze. The angel ornament had moved. It was no longer on the branch where she'd seen it last night. Now it sat lower on the tree, its wooden face turned toward the staircase as if it had been watching them descend. Her grip on the bat tightened. "It's just gravity," she said, though her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. Jamie wasn't convinced, and neither was she. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time she passed the tree, she felt the angel's gaze boring into her back. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, she decided to confront her fear. Armed with her phone's flashlight and a knot of determination in her chest, she approached the tree. The angel seemed to grin at her as she got closer. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the cold, wooden surface. "What are you?" she whispered, as if expecting an answer. The lights on the tree flickered. Elena stumbled back, her heart pounding. She stared at the angel, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But it didn't move. Just as she turned to leave, she heard it again. That whisper. "Don't let her see you." This time it was louder. "Elena?" A voice came from behind her. She spun around to see her mother standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "What are you doing?" her mom asked, her voice strained. "There's something wrong with the tree," Elena blurted out. Her mother's expression darkened. "Go to bed," she said sharply, her tone colder than Elena had ever heard. "But now." Elena obeyed, but sleep didn't come. And when the whispers started again, this time they came from inside her room. Elena lay frozen in her bed, her blankets pulled tightly around her as the whispers grew louder. They weren't just faint sounds now, they were deliberate, distinct. "Elena?" Her breath hitched. That voice, it wasn't Jamie's and it wasn't her mother's. It was cold, raspy, and unnervingly close. She gripped the baseball bat beside her bed, her knuckles white. "Elena?" The whisper came again, this time accompanied by the faint sound of something scraping against the floor. She forced herself to sit up, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was bathed in shadows, the only light coming from the faint glow of the snow-covered yard outside. Her eyes scanned every corner, searching for the source of the noise. The whispers stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it felt alive. And then she saw it, a faint movement near the doorway. "Elena?" The sound wasn't coming from outside her room. It was coming from under her bed. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But something stronger, curiosity, fear, or maybe sheer defiance, kept her rooted in place. Slowly, gripping the bat tightly, she leaned over the edge of her bed and lowered her head to peer underneath. For a moment, all she saw was darkness. And then two gleaming eyes stared back at her. She let out a scream, scrambling backward until her back hit the headboard. Her bedroom door flew open and her mother rushed in, followed closely by Jamie. "What's going on?" her mother demanded, flicking on the light. Elena pointed a trembling finger toward the bed. There's something under there." Her mother knelt down and peered beneath the bed. After a moment, she sat back up, her expression unreadable. "There's nothing there, Elena." "No, I saw." "It's late," her mother cut her off. "You're tired. Go back to sleep." "But..." "Enough," her mother snapped, her voice uncharacteristically harsh. "Go to sleep." Elena stared at her mother, confused and terrified. This wasn't like her at all. Her mom grabbed Jamie by the arm and led him out of the room, closing the door behind them. The moment they were gone, Elena felt the silence creep back in. She didn't sleep that night. The following morning, the atmosphere in the house was different. Her mom seemed tense, barely speaking to anyone, while Jamie refused to leave her side. "Elena?" he whispered while they ate breakfast. "I think Mom knows something." "What do you mean?" "She was acting weird last night. Like really weird. And I saw her, talking to the tree." Elena stopped mid-bite. "What?" Jamie nodded. "I woke up and went downstairs to get some water. She was just standing there, staring at the tree and talking. But there was no one there." A chill ran down Elena's spine. That afternoon, when her mom left to run errands, Elena decided to investigate. "Stay here," she told Jamie as she grabbed the bat and approached the living room. The tree stood as it always did, its lights twinkling innocently. But the angel ornament was different now. It wasn't just looking at her, it was pointing. Its tiny wooden arm, which had previously hung limply at its side, was now raised, its finger aimed directly at the hallway. She swallowed hard and followed the direction it pointed, her pulse racing. At the end of the hallway was the basement door. It was slightly ajar, a faint draft seeping through the gap. "Elena, what are you doing?" Jamie's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing behind her, his face pale. "Go back upstairs," she said firmly. "No way. I'm not leaving you alone." With Jamie close behind, she pushed the basement door open. The stairs creaked loudly as they descended into the darkness. "Stay close," she whispered. The basement was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The air was thick with a damp, musty smell, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. "Elena," Jamie whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "What's that?" She followed his gaze to a large, dusty trunk in the corner. It looked ancient, its surface covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood. As they approached, the whispers started again. "Elena, Jamie?" The voices came from the trunk, low and guttural. "Don't open it," Jamie begged, but Elena couldn't stop herself. Something about the trunk called to her, demanded her attention. She reached out and unlatched the rusted lock. The moment she lifted the lid, the whispers stopped. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. Scrawled across it in jagged handwriting were the words, "She sees you now." Before they could react, the basement door slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. "Elena!" Jamie screamed, grabbing her arm. The bulb above flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the room. And then they heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the stairs. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the growl grew louder, reverberating through the basement like a warning. She tightened her grip on Jamie's arm, pulling him closer. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice shaking but defiant. There was no answer. Only the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs. Jamie clutched her side, his small frame trembling. "Elena, what's happening?" "I don't know," she whispered, her eyes locked on the staircase. The bulb flickered again, plunging them into brief moments of pitch black before the light returned, weaker than before. And then they saw it. A shadow, tall and twisted, with elongated limbs, stood halfway down the staircase. Its head was cocked unnaturally to one side, and its movements were slow, almost deliberate, as it stepped closer. "Elena," the whisper came again, but this time it wasn't from the shadow. It was behind them. They spun around to find the trunk still open, its lid creaking as if something inside was straining to get out. The symbols etched into the wood seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "We need to get out of here," Elena said, pulling Jamie toward the stairs. But the shadow blocked their path now, its form stretching unnaturally to fill the narrow staircase. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, empty and suffocating. "Run!" Elena screamed, yanking Jamie toward the corner of the basement. They stumbled over discarded furniture and old boxes, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The shadow didn't follow. Instead, it stood perfectly still, its presence filling the room with a suffocating pressure. "What does it want?" Jamie whimpered. Elena glanced back at the trunk. The paper inside it seemed to glow faintly now, the jagged words almost alive. "She sees you now." Her mind raced. The angel ornament, the whispers, the trunk, it was all connected. Whatever had been sealed in that chest had been watching them through the tree, waiting for someone to release it. And now it was here. "Elena," the whisper came again, louder this time, as if the voice were right in her ear. She grabbed the lid of the trunk and slammed it shut, hoping it would stop whatever was happening. But the moment the trunk closed, the basement was plunged into complete darkness. "Elena!" Jamie screamed, his voice muffled by the oppressive silence. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the shadow now standing just inches away from them. "Elena?" Its voice was a low growl now, deep and menacing. She swung the bat wildly, the metal clanging against the concrete floor as the shadow dissolved into smoke, only to reappear a moment later, closer this time. "Jamie, go!" she shouted, pushing him toward the staircase. "But, go?" Jamie hesitated, then bolted up the stairs, his small feet pounding against the wood. Elena followed, her heart pounding as the shadow surged forward. They reached the top of the stairs just as the door burst open. Her mom stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "What's going on?" she demanded, grabbing Jamie and pulling him close. "The tree," Elena shouted, slamming the basement door shut. "It's the tree. There's something wrong with it." Her mom's face hardened. "You shouldn't have gone down there." "What?" Elena stared at her, confused and angry. "You knew about this?" "I tried to keep you safe," her mom said, her voice shaking. I thought if we left it alone, it would leave us alone." "What is it?" Her mom hesitated, glancing toward the living room where the tree stood glowing softly. "It's not just a decoration. A marker. A gateway." "A gateway to what?" Elena demanded. Her mom didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantel and headed toward the tree. "What are you doing?" Elena asked, following her. "We have to destroy it," her mom said, her voice trembling. But before she could reach the tree, the lights flickered violently, and the angel ornament turned its head. "Elena," the voice came again, this time louder, echoing through the house. The walls seemed to tremble as the tree's lights blinked erratically, casting shadows that moved on their own. Her mom hesitated, fear flashing across her face. "Get out of the house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I'm not leaving you," Elena shouted. "Go," her mom screamed, her eyes darting toward the angel. But before any of them could move, the tree's lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. "Elena?" The whisper was deafening now, surrounding them, consuming them. And then the angel began to laugh. The laughter echoed through the darkness, sharp and unnatural, as if it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Elena felt Jamie's small hand gripping hers tightly, his trembling fingers the only thing grounding her in the chaos. "Elena," the voice rasped again, drawing out her name as though savoring every syllable. Her mom stood frozen near the tree, her eyes wide and unblinking, the candlestick slipping from her grasp and landing on the floor with a dull thud. "It's too late," she whispered. "No," Elena yelled, stepping in front of her mother and Jamie. "It's not too late. We can stop this." The angel ornament began to move. Its wooden body twisted unnaturally, its tiny wings creaking as they unfurled. The once frozen figure now glared at them with glowing eyes, its carved mouth opening wide as a guttural growl emerged. The Christmas tree began to shake violently, ornaments crashing to the floor, their glass shards scattering across the room. The angel's voice boomed, no longer a whisper but a command. "You let me in, and now you belong to me." Elena gritted her teeth, her mind racing. There had to be a way to stop this. The trunk, the paper, the symbols. They weren't just decorations, they were a seal, a warning. "Elena, what do we do?" Jamie's voice was barely audible over the chaos. She thought quickly, remembering the strange symbols carved into the trunk and the way they had glowed. It had to mean something. Those symbols were the key. "The trunk," she said, turning to her mom. "What's the story behind it? What is all of this?" Her mother hesitated, her face pale and stricken with fear. "It belonged to the previous owners of the house," she admitted. "They warned me when we moved in, but I didn't believe them. They said the tree was cursed, that it would come to life if anyone disturbed the seal." Elena felt her blood turn cold. "And you didn't think to tell us?" "I thought it was just a story," her mother cried. "But when the tree was already here, I thought, maybe it wasn't. Not helpful right now." Elena snapped, gripping the bat tightly. "How do we stop it?" Her mom shook her head. "I don't know. They said once it starts, it can't be undone. It wants something." The angel let out another laugh, its wooden body stretching unnaturally as it crawled down the tree like a spider. "It wants us," Elena realized. "No," Jamie whimpered, burying his face in her side. "The trunk. If the symbols were a seal, then maybe they could be used again." Elena's gaze darted toward the basement door, still shut but shaking on its hinges as if something were trying to force it open from the other side. "We have to get back to the trunk," she said, grabbing Jamie's hand. "That's the only way." "Elena, no," her mom protested, but there was no time to argue. With Jamie in tow, Elena sprinted toward the basement, the angel's screeching voice following close behind. "You cannot escape." The basement door burst open with a deafening crash, and the force sent them tumbling down the stairs. Elena hit the cold concrete floor with a groan, her flashlight skidding out of reach. "Jamie, are you okay?" she asked, scrambling to her feet. "I'm fine," he whispered, though his voice trembled. The basement was darker than before, the air heavy and suffocating. The trunk sat in the corner, its surface glowing faintly with the same strange symbols. Elena lunged for it, yanking the lid open. The paper was still inside, the words glowing as if alive. "She sees you now. What does it mean?" Jamie asked, his voice panicked. Elena thought hard, her eyes scanning the symbols on the trunk's lid. They weren't just random carvings, they formed a pattern, a sequence. "Elena!" Jamie screamed, pointing behind her. She turned to see the angel, now larger and more grotesque, its wings stretching impossibly wide as it loomed over them. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, splintered teeth. "Give me what is mine," it roared. Elena's hands trembled as she traced the symbols with her fingers, hoping they would reveal something, anything, that could help. Suddenly, a memory flashed in her mind, the way the symbols had glowed when she first opened the trunk. "Jamie, grab that flashlight," she shouted. He scrambled to retrieve it, handing it to her with shaking hands. Elena aimed the beam directly at the trunk, illuminating the symbols. As the light hit them, they began to glow brighter, the carvings pulsating with an otherworldly energy. The angel let out a deafening shriek, its form flickering like static. "It's working," Jamie yelled. Elena didn't know how or why, but she continued to shine the light on the symbols, tracing them with her fingers. The glow intensified and the air around them seemed to vibrate. The angel lunged toward her, its clawed hand reaching out, but as it made contact with the trunk, the symbols flared with blinding light. A deafening roar filled the basement as the angel's form began to dissolve, its wooden body splintering into pieces. The light from the trunk grew brighter and brighter until it was impossible to see anything. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. Elena opened her eyes slowly. The basement was still. The trunk sat in the corner, its lid closed and the symbols faintly glowing. Jamie clung to her side, his face pale but alive. "Is it gone?" Elena nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. "I think so." They climbed the stairs together, their legs weak and trembling. The living room was quiet now, the Christmas tree standing dark and lifeless. The angel ornament was gone, nothing but a pile of splinters at its base. Her mom sat on the couch, her face buried in her hands. When she saw them, she rushed over, pulling them into a tight hug. "It's over," Elena said softly, though the words felt hollow. That night, as they sat together in the dim light of the remaining decorations, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. Somewhere in the shadows of the house, the whispers had simply gone quiet. The minutes that passed after the tree's final tremble felt like hours. The house was deathly quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind outside and the faint creaks of the wooden floors beneath their feet. But Elena could feel it, the presence still lingering in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Elena stood motionless, staring at the angel ornament that now glowed faintly at the top of the tree. Its face was no longer the serene, innocent figure it had been when they first placed it there. Now it looked twisted, demonic, its features sharp and exaggerated, eyes glowing with an unnatural light that seemed to pierce into her very soul. It wasn't just watching anymore, it was alive and it was calling to them. "Elena," the voice rasped again, louder this time. It echoed around the room, vibrating in the very walls. The sound felt like a physical force pushing against her chest, urging her to listen, to come closer. But Elena couldn't. She didn't want to. "Mom," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't even recognize her own tone, so raw, so filled with fear. "What's happening? What is this thing?" Her mother, who had been standing beside her, motionless and pale, finally turned to face her. Her eyes were wide with terror, but also something else, something darker. She looked like she had aged years in a matter of minutes, the weight of the past catching up to her all at once. "I never should have let you bring that tree inside," her mother whispered, almost to herself. "I thought it was just an old superstition. But it wasn't. That tree, it's a marker, a gateway. And once it's opened, once it starts, there's no going back." Elena shook her head. "But the angel ornament, what does it want with us? What do we have to do?" Her mother's face twisted in pain as she spoke. "It's not just the tree, Elena. It's everything. The trunk, the ornaments, the angel. It's all part of the ritual. It's a cursed cycle that's been repeating for generations, always finding new victims. The tree calls to them, chooses them, and once it does," her voice faltered and she looked at Jamie, who was huddled close to Elena. "Once it has chosen, it doesn't let go." A cold chill swept through the room as the words settled into Elena's mind. She glanced at Jamie, who was too terrified to speak, his face pale and eyes wide, staring at the tree with a mixture of awe and fear. She knew in that moment, her mother was right. There was no escaping this curse. The tree trembled again, sending the ornaments hanging on its branches rattling. The angel's eyes seemed to burn with malicious intent as it turned its head toward them. It no longer looked like a decorative figure, it was a creature, something ancient and evil. Its mouth opened wider and wider, and the voice came from its depths. "Elena," it spoke her name again, and this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, a plea, an invitation. "Come to me." Her heart pounded in her chest as the room grew colder, the temperature dropping as if the house itself was being pulled into some other world. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the weight of centuries of evil was crashing down on them. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked as if they were being slowly consumed by the darkness. And that voice, That voice filled every corner of the room. Elena? Elena's hands trembled as she reached for Jamie, pulling him closer to her side. We have to leave. Now, she said, her voice frantic. Her mother's eyes shifted toward the door, but there was no escape in her expression. It won't let us, she whispered, barely audible. Once it begins, it doesn't stop. You can't run from it. It's already inside you. What do you mean, inside us? Elena's voice shook with desperation. What do we have to do to stop it? Her mother met her gaze, her eyes haunted, as though the weight of everything she hadn't said for years was now coming to the surface. I tried to destroy it. I thought if I left it alone, the curse would leave us alone. But the truth is, it needs a soul to feed on. A soul to complete the ritual. It doesn't matter who you are or where you came from. It chooses, and once you're chosen, there's no turning back. Elena felt her stomach drop. The air was so thick with tension that she could hardly breathe. What had they unleashed? She had thought it was just a creepy tree, a spooky old tradition. But this was something far worse. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shake. A low rumble echoed from beneath the house, as though the very foundations of their world were being ripped apart. The tree trembled violently, its lights flickering, casting eerie, distorted shadows around the room. And then, as if sensing her fear, the angel ornament twisted its head further, its wooden face contorting into a grotesque smile. No, Elena gasped, stepping back, dragging Jamie with her. We have to stop it before it's too late. Her mother shook her head slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. There's no stopping it now. It's already begun. The angel's voice grew louder, more insistent. Elena, come closer. A force, cold and suffocating, seemed to pull Elena forward, like invisible hands gripping her body, guiding her toward the tree. Her mother tried to reach for her, but it was too late. Elena felt her feet moving against her will, her body trembling as she was drawn into the sphere of the tree's power. Mom? Elena screamed, her voice breaking. I don't want this. I don't want this. But her mother could do nothing. Her arms were limp at her sides, her eyes empty. She was a shell of the person Elena had once known. Please, Elena pleaded, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness that now consumed the room. And then the tree erupted in light. Brilliant, blinding light that filled the entire room, suffocating them in its brilliance. The angel ornament split open, revealing not just a face but a gaping maw, filled with jagged teeth like a trap closing in. Elena, you are mine, the voice whispered, its tone a sickening mix of joy and hunger. As the light enveloped her, Elena could no longer resist. Her world faded to black. Story 3. The snowstorm came without warning. One moment, the town of Everpine was alive with Christmas cheer, twinkling lights strung across every street, the scent of cinnamon wafting from bakeries and laughter spilling out of warm homes. Families gathered around their Christmas trees, wrapping last-minute presents, and children's excited whispers about Santa filled the air. Then came the silence. It wasn't the comforting kind of stillness that made you feel cozy on a cold winter's night. This was different, heavy, suffocating, and raw. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath. Outside, the wind stopped howling, the carolers' voices abruptly ceased, and even the town's iconic church bell, a fixture that chimed every hour, stood frozen in time. In the middle of it all was Claire Harper. At 16, Christmas was still her favorite time of year. She loved everything about it, the music, the lights, the sense of magic that seemed to hang in the air. Her room was a Christmas wonderland, decorated with strings of fairy lights, a miniature tree by her window, and a collection of handmade ornaments she and her little brother Ethan had made over the years. That night, she sat cross-legged on the living room floor, wrapping the final gift for Ethan. It was a rare collectible video game he'd been talking about for months, and Claire had saved every penny from her part-time job to buy it. The fireplace crackled nearby, filling the room with a soft amber glow. Claire, hurry up. The movie's starting. Ethan called from the couch. He was 11, with a mop of dark hair and a mischievous grin. The two had a tradition of watching Home Alone every Christmas Eve, complete with hot chocolate and way too many marshmallows. 2 seconds. Claire called back, tying a perfect bow on the gift. She admired her work for a moment before sliding the present under the tree. And that's when it happened. The first knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Claire heard it. She paused, her hand hovering over the tree, and glanced toward the front door. Did you hear that? she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Hear what? Ethan didn't even look up, too engrossed in his game. Before Claire could respond, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out, plunging the house into darkness. Ugh, power outage, Ethan groaned, fumbling for his flashlight. But Claire wasn't so sure. She moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain. The snowstorm had thickened, blanketing the world in white. And there, at the edge of their driveway, stood a figure. It was barely visible through the swirling snow, a shadowy silhouette that didn't move. Claire's stomach tightened. Ethan, she whispered. Someone's outside. What are you talking about? He joined her at the window, squinting into the storm. But by the time he looked, the figure was gone. Probably just the snow playing tricks on you, Ethan said with a shrug, but Claire couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. She tried to ignore it, returning to the couch and wrapping herself in a blanket. The fire had dimmed, and the room felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in minutes. Then came the second knock. This time it was louder, sharp and deliberate, like knuckles rapping against wood. Both Claire and Ethan froze, their eyes darting to the front door. Who's knocking during a storm like this? Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Stay here, Claire said, her pulse quickening. She grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door, every creak of the floorboards making her flinch. When she opened it, the freezing wind rushed in, stinging her cheeks. But the porch was empty. No footsteps in the snow. No sign of anyone. Just a small, neatly wrapped package sitting on the welcome mat. The box was plain, tied with a red ribbon, and the tag attached to it sent chills down her spine. Do not open until midnight. Who leaves something like this? Claire muttered, picking it up. The box was surprisingly heavy, and for a brief moment she thought she felt it move. What is it? Ethan asked, appearing at her side. I don't know. It doesn't have a name or address. Maybe it's a prank? Claire didn't respond. Her instincts told her to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of her. She brought the package inside and set it on the coffee table. Ethan reached for it, but she stopped him. Wait, the tag says not to open it until midnight? Seriously? You're going to listen to some creepy note? But Claire wasn't sure why she hesitated. Something about the box felt wrong. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but Claire couldn't stop glancing at the package. Midnight was only an hour away, and the anticipation gnawed at her. Outside, the storm raged on, and the unease in the air grew thicker. When the clock struck 12, Claire and Ethan sat in front of the box. It was Ethan who finally said, Well, are we going to open it or not? Claire took a deep breath and untied the ribbon. As she lifted the lid, the room seemed to hold its breath. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. Claire unfolded it, her hands trembling. The message was short, written in elegant, spidery handwriting. Asterisk, you should have left it outside. Asterisk. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the room was bathed in an eerie glow. But something was different. The fire had gone out completely, and the warmth it had provided was replaced by an unnatural chill. Then they heard it, a low, guttural sound coming from upstairs. A sound that didn't belong to either of them. Claire and Ethan exchanged a terrified glance. They weren't alone anymore. For a moment, neither of them moved. Claire clutched the note in her hand, her fingers trembling as she tried to make sense of the words. Asterisk, you should have left it outside. Asterisk, what was that? Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The sound came again, a low, guttural noise like someone, or something, dragging their nails across old wood. It wasn't just upstairs anymore. It was closer. Stay here, Claire whispered, though her heart raced so fast she thought it might burst. Are you crazy? You're not going up there. Ethan's face was pale, his wide eyes darting between the note and the dark staircase. Claire grabbed the flashlight, its beam flickering slightly as if it too were afraid. She didn't answer Ethan. Instead, she took a tentative step toward the stairs. Each creak beneath her feet felt deafening in the stillness. Halfway up, she stopped. The air grew colder with each step, almost as if the temperature were dropping by the second. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and her hand trembled so much she had to grip the railing tightly to keep from falling. Claire, don't. Ethan's whisper carried up the stairs, but she couldn't turn back now. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, dark and foreboding. The family's old Christmas decorations lined the walls, framed photos of happier times, garlands draped along the banister. But now they seemed distorted, almost menacing in the dim light. Then she saw it. The door to her parents' room was ajar, the faintest glow spilling out into the hallway. It wasn't the warm glow of a lamp or a candle. It was cold, bluish, and wrong. Claire's fingers tightened around the flashlight as she approached. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run, but something compelled her forward. She pushed the door open. The room was empty, or so it seemed. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and everything appeared exactly as it should have been. But the glow, it emanated from the far corner where the closet door stood slightly open. Claire? Ethan's voice floated up from downstairs, but she couldn't respond. She was too focused on the closet. Her footsteps were slow, hesitant. The glow pulsed faintly, growing stronger as she drew closer. When she was just inches away, she reached out, her hand trembling, and pulled the door open. The light vanished instantly, leaving her in pitch black. And then came the whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have brought it inside." Claire stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the walls. She turned, bolting out of the room and down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. Ethan was waiting at the bottom, his face pale with fear. "What happened? What did you see?" "There's something up there," Claire managed to gasp, her voice shaky. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the living room. "We need to get out of here." "But it's a storm outside," Ethan protested. "I don't care." Claire snapped, her fear overtaking her usual calm demeanor. Before they could make it to the door, the lights flickered again. This time they didn't come back on. The darkness felt heavier now, pressing down on them like a living thing. The only source of light was the weak beam of Claire's flashlight, which seemed to be dimming by the second. Then the sound returned. It was no longer upstairs. It was inside the house. A scraping, dragging noise as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. And it was coming from the kitchen. "Stay behind me," Claire whispered, though her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the flashlight steady. They crept toward the kitchen, the sound growing louder with each step. Claire's mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening, but nothing made sense. When they reached the doorway, she stopped. The kitchen was empty, or so it appeared at first glance. The sound had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then Ethan pointed. "Claire, the fridge." The refrigerator door stood slightly ajar, a thin trail of frost creeping out onto the floor. The temperature in the room dropped even further, making their breaths come out in visible clouds. Claire moved closer, her steps cautious. She reached for the fridge handle, her heart pounding in her chest, and pulled it open. Inside was the same package from before, now covered in a thin layer of frost. But it wasn't the package itself that made her blood run cold, it was the fact that it shouldn't have been there. They had left it on the coffee table. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "Claire, what's happening?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was spinning, trying to piece together the impossible. How had the package moved? And then she saw it. On the fridge door, written in frost, were 3 words. "Midnight was first." What does that mean? Ethan asked, his voice breaking. Before Claire could respond, the dragging sound returned, louder and closer than ever. This time it was coming from behind them. They turned slowly, the flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the room. At first there was nothing. Just shadows and the faint outline of the dining table. Then the shadows moved. From the darkness emerged a figure, hunched and unnatural, its movements jerky and deliberate. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same eerie blue light that had spilled from the upstairs closet. Claire grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him back. "Run?" But as they turned, the figure spoke, its voice guttural and filled with malice. "You should have left it outside." The figure's words hung in the air like a curse, chilling Claire to her core. The flashlight shook violently in her hand as she pulled Ethan toward the living room. "Go. Don't stop," she yelled, her voice cracking with panic. Ethan stumbled but managed to keep up, his small hand gripping hers tightly. Behind them, the dragging sound grew louder, punctuated by the figure's uneven footsteps. It was following them. Claire's mind raced as they burst into the living room. The storm outside howled like a living beast, rattling the windows and sending waves of snow swirling against the glass. She glanced at the front door, but a sickening realization stopped her cold. The lock was turning on its own. Click. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but the raging snowstorm beyond. But Claire knew better. Whatever was outside was no safer than what was behind them. "We can't stay here," Ethan cried, his voice filled with desperation. Claire scanned the room, her thoughts a chaotic blur. The figure was closing in, and the open door felt like a trap. Then her eyes landed on the basement door, half hidden in the corner, shrouded in shadow. "Down there," she said, pulling Ethan toward it. "The basement? Are you serious? Just trust me." They threw open the door and descended the narrow staircase, the wooden steps groaning under their weight. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time they reached the bottom, it felt like they were stepping into a freezer. Claire fumbled for the light switch, her fingers numb from the cold. When the dim bulb flickered to life, it cast long, eerie shadows across the room. The basement was cluttered with old boxes, broken furniture, and forgotten holiday decorations. Ethan clung to her arm, his eyes darting around nervously. "Do you think it's safe down here?" Claire didn't answer. She was too busy scanning the room, looking for anything they could use to protect themselves. A heavy wrench on the workbench caught her eye, and she grabbed it without hesitation. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a soft tapping like fingernails on wood. Claire turned toward the source, her breath catching in her throat. The package. It sat in the middle of the basement floor, impossibly placed, its red ribbon fluttering slightly despite the still air. "No," Claire whispered. Ethan's voice trembled. "How did it get down here?" The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if something inside the package was trying to get out. Claire's grip on the wrench tightened. She stepped forward cautiously, every fiber of her being screaming at her to stop. As she reached the package, the tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. "Claire, don't," Ethan pleaded, his voice barely audible. But she couldn't ignore it. Slowly, she reached down and untied the ribbon. The lid lifted easily, almost as if it wanted her to open it. Inside was a photograph. Claire picked it up, her hands trembling. The image was faded and grainy, but she recognized the scene instantly. It was their living room, her Ethan and their parents gathered around the Christmas tree from years ago. But something was wrong. In the corner of the photo, partially obscured by shadows, was the figure. Its glowing eyes stared directly at the camera, its twisted form blending unnaturally with the background. Claire's stomach churned. This can't be real. Before she could process what she was seeing, the basement light flickered violently and went out, plunging them into darkness. Ethan screamed, and Claire grabbed him, holding him close. The flashlight flickered back to life, its beam weak and erratic. Then came the voice again. "You shouldn't have opened it." The figure's silhouette appeared at the top of the stairs, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Claire's instincts took over. She pulled Ethan behind her, raising the wrench like a weapon. "Stay away," she shouted, her voice trembling but firm. The figure didn't move. It stood there, motionless, its unnatural presence filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. Then, slowly, it began to descend the stairs. Claire backed up, her mind racing. The basement was a dead end. They were trapped. Ethan's voice was a terrified whisper. "Claire, what do we do?" She didn't have an answer. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear herself think. And then, as if responding to her desperation, the photograph in her hand began to change. The image shifted, the shadows moving across the paper like liquid. The scene transformed, revealing something new, a message scrawled in dark, jagged letters. Asterisk, there's still time to put it back. Asterisk. Claire's breath hitched. Was it a warning? A way out? The figure was halfway down the stairs now, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Claire made a split-second decision. She grabbed the package, slammed the lid shut, and turned to Ethan. "Stay close to me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "What are you doing?" "I'm ending this." Claire bolted up the stairs, dragging Ethan with her. The figure let out an inhuman shriek, its form twisting unnaturally as it lunged after them. They burst into the living room, the storm outside howling louder than ever. Claire ran to the open door and threw the package onto the porch. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind tore at her hair and the snow stung her skin, but the figure stopped at the doorway, its glowing eyes narrowing. Then, slowly, it stepped back. The package began to sink into the snow, disappearing as if the ground itself was swallowing it whole. The figure faded with it, its glowing eyes the last thing to vanish. The storm died down almost instantly, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. Claire and Ethan stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming out in ragged gasps. "Is it gone?" Ethan asked hesitantly. Claire didn't answer. She stepped outside, her eyes scanning the snow-covered yard. There was no sign of the package or the figure, but the unease in her chest remained. The voice on the other side of the door was unlike any Claire had ever heard. It wasn't human, too cold, too distant, like a whisper from a place beyond this world. "Midnight isn't the end. It's only the beginning." The words hung in the air, suffocating and heavy. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as she stepped away from the door. Who is that?" Ethan whispered, his face pale with fear. "I don't know," Claire managed to reply, her voice shaking. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The package, the figure, the photos, it was all connected, and now this voice. The figure hadn't just been after them, it had been waiting for midnight. The house felt colder, the darkness outside pressing in against the walls. Claire backed away from the door, trying to shake the feeling that something was on the other side, watching, waiting. She turned to Ethan. "We need to get out of here." "But what about the thing?" he asked, his voice filled with dread. "We can't stay here. It's not safe anymore." Ethan didn't argue. He nodded, his wide eyes locked on her. Claire grabbed her jacket from the couch and pulled it on, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something worse than the figure, something far more sinister. The front door rattled again, this time more violently, the handle twisting as if something on the other side was trying to get in. "Claire, hurry," Ethan urged, his voice breaking with panic. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ethan's hand and yanked him toward the back of the house, away from the front door. The flashlight trembled in her hand, its weak beam cutting through the darkness. They ran down the hallway past the kitchen toward the back door. But as Claire reached for the handle, she froze. The door was already open. The air was thick with a bitter cold that shouldn't have been possible inside a house. Snow drifted in, swirling like a ghostly mist in the dim light. Claire glanced back toward the living room, but there was no sign of the figure. No movement, no footsteps. She had a bad feeling. "It's gone," she muttered, half to herself. "But why is the door open?" "Maybe it's a trap," Ethan whispered, his voice quivering. Claire shook her head, the weight of the decision pulling at her. They had no other choice. The thing on the other side of the door could be waiting for them, but so could whatever was inside. She pulled the door shut with a soft click, her fingers barely touching the cold wood. But the click was enough. The figure appeared. It wasn't at the front door. It wasn't even in the house. But Claire knew it was there, just beyond the door, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment. Her skin prickled with fear. She couldn't explain how, but Claire was certain that whatever was waiting for them, whatever had been manipulating the house, the photo, the package, was connected to the figure. And now it was too late to run. Claire's thoughts raced. The figure. The lullaby. The message in the closet. Midnight. All of it was connected. But how? It was as if the house itself was a living, breathing thing, every corner hiding a new horror, every shadow holding a secret. Ethan tugged at her sleeve. "What do we do now?" Claire's voice faltered, but she forced herself to speak. "We have to figure out what's going on. We need to get to the bottom of this." Ethan nodded, but Claire could see the fear in his eyes. "How do we stop it?" "I don't know." Claire's voice was hollow. "But I'll protect you, I promise." And just like that, the air shifted again. The temperature plummeted even further, the cold becoming unbearable. Claire could see her breath in the air, her hands shaking as she reached for the flashlight. The beam flickered, and then it went out. In the pitch-black silence, Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't see her hand in front of her face, and the darkness felt as if it were closing in. "Claire?" Ethan's voice cracked in the darkness. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here." Suddenly the house groaned. The walls creaked and rattled like the bones of something ancient. The sound was deafening, like something was moving through the walls, something that shouldn't have been able to move. A low, rasping breath echoed through the air, closer than before. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The sound was behind them. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes adjusted to the faint light creeping through the cracks in the walls. And then she saw it. A shadow, tall and shapeless, loomed at the end of the hallway. Its edges flickered and shifted, like smoke curling in the air. Ethan grabbed her hand tightly, his fingers cold with fear. "What is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. "But we have to get out of here. Now." They turned and ran, but the shadow didn't follow. Stayed there watching. Waiting. Claire and Ethan burst into the kitchen, their hearts pounding, the icy breath of the shadow following them. The back door was their only way out, but as Claire reached for the handle, it swung open by itself. Beyond it, the snowstorm raged, the wind howling like an animal, but there was no safe escape. The shadow seemed to beckon them forward, its eerie presence closing in like a noose tightening around their throats. Claire didn't know what was worse, being stuck inside with whatever was hunting them or stepping outside into the unknown. The shadow moved again. A new voice echoed through the house, low, guttural, and impossibly distant. "It's too late for you." Claire froze. The voice was coming from everywhere, from inside the walls, the floor, the air. It was everywhere. The shadow shifted, its form solidifying, becoming a shape, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow, glowing eyes. And the worst part? It was smiling. The figure stood motionless in the doorway, its silhouette flickering in the dim light like an old, distorted television screen. Its smile was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. There was no warmth in it, only a coldness that sent a shiver through Claire's spine. Claire couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare at it, her mind screaming at her to run, to move, but her body refused to obey. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his small voice trembling. "Claire, we need to go." Claire's eyes darted between the shadow and the door. But the doorway had already closed behind them, and the cold was suffocating. The figure stepped forward. Slowly, as though savoring each moment, it dragged its long, spindly fingers across the frame of the door. The nails, if they could even be called that, were like claws, sharp and blackened, and the sound they made as they scraped against the wood was like fingernails on a chalkboard. Ethan gasped. Claire's mind raced. She needed to protect him. She couldn't let this thing take him. But the creature didn't move toward them. Instead, it just watched, its glowing eyes fixed on Claire's face. It tilted its head as though studying her, as if it knew something she didn't. And then it spoke. Not much longer now. Its voice was rasping, dry like leaves in the wind, but somehow it echoed all around them. It was in the air, in the walls, in the very ground beneath their feet. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" Claire's throat closed. What do you want from us?" The smile on the figure's face twisted, becoming more menacing, and Claire's blood ran cold. "You are the key," it rasped. "To everything." Claire's mind whirled. The key. What did that mean? And what did it have to do with them? The shadow's smile grew wider, the edges of its mouth curling back unnaturally as if to tear its face apart. "You don't know it yet, but you've already begun. The pieces are already set into place." Claire shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, we haven't done anything." The creature didn't respond. It just stared at her, its hollow eyes glowing brighter, pulsing like two dim lights in the dark. Ethan squeezed her hand. "I'm scared, Claire." "I know," Claire whispered, trying to swallow her own fear. "But I won't let it hurt you. I'll protect you." The creature's gaze shifted from Claire to Ethan, and for a moment, it seemed to soften, the smile disappearing. It tilted its head again as if considering something. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, it spoke to Ethan. "Do you know what happens when the clock strikes midnight?" Ethan's eyes widened in confusion and fear. I don't know." "Everything changes," the figure said, its voice chillingly calm. "Time is no longer what you think it is. You've already crossed the line. Now you can never go back." Ethan's face went pale and he looked up at Claire, his eyes filled with terror. "What does that mean?" Claire demanded, her voice tight with panic. The figure said nothing, but its smile returned, stretching wider still, the darkness around it deepening. It took another step forward, and this time Claire didn't flinch. She had no time for fear. She had to think. The figure reached out, its long fingers hovering in the air as if it was about to touch her, but then it stopped, its gaze fixed on the wall beside them. Claire followed its stare. The wall. She didn't know why, but something about it seemed different now. The air was heavier, and the room itself felt like it was closing in. Slowly, she turned her head to look at the wall, the same place where the message "midnight" had been scrawled earlier. And now the letters were changing. They weren't just written in ink anymore. They were glowing, bright, pulsing red, and they were shifting, rearranging before her eyes. The letters morphed and twisted as if they were alive. The new message was unmistakable. Asterisk, you can never escape. Asterisk. Claire's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. The figure began to laugh, low and guttural, the sound reverberating through the walls. You can run. You can hide. But you'll never escape. The clock is ticking, and soon you'll understand exactly why you're here. No, Claire whispered, her body shaking with dread. This can't be happening. But the figure's laugh only grew louder. The room around them seemed to tremble. The walls creaked, the floor groaned, and the temperature dropped even further. Claire could see her breath in front of her now, swirling in the freezing air. Ethan pressed against her, his eyes wide with terror. Claire, I don't want to be here anymore. Claire pulled him close, her mind racing. She couldn't let him see her fear. She had to be strong. The figure took another step closer. It's too late, it said softly, almost pityingly. You've already been marked. And once you're marked, there's no going back. Claire turned toward the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening crash. Her heart pounded in her chest as she frantically tried to turn the handle. It wouldn't budge. We have to get out of here, she screamed. But the shadow was already upon them. Ethan gasped, clutching her tightly. Claire turned around just in time to see the figure's hand reach toward her, its fingers like ice, reaching for her throat. No, Claire shouted, raising her arm in defense. But the shadow's touch was like freezing steel, and it sent a wave of cold through her body. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Everything around her seemed to blur, the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath her feet. She felt her consciousness slipping away. And then the voice came again, the one that echoed in her mind, louder than the rest. Asterisk midnight asterisk. The wind howled through the trees, a cold, biting gust that seemed to carry with it whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that slipped in and out of Claire's consciousness. She tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the road ahead, but no matter how fast she ran, the eerie chill never left her. The storm was picking up, the snow swirling in thick clouds around them, reducing visibility to mere shadows. Ethan stumbled beside her, his breath visible in the freezing air. Claire, do you think it's gone? Claire didn't answer right away. Her mind was racing, but her body was tired. Every muscle screamed for rest, but the nagging feeling, the one that had been clawing at her since they escaped the house, refused to let her relax. I don't know, she said finally, her voice strained. I don't think it's over. Ethan's eyes widened, and he looked over his shoulder. The empty road stretched behind them, quiet and lifeless, as if nothing had ever happened. But Claire knew better. She could still feel it, the presence, the oppressive weight that had been hovering just beyond her reach. They had made it out of the house, but something told her that it wasn't just the building that was cursed. The darkness was out there, waiting. The shadow had never been confined to the house, and neither had its twisted, malevolent power. They walked for what felt like hours, their feet heavy with snow, the silence of the night broken only by the occasional groan of the wind. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching out into the unknown, but Claire kept moving, her eyes scanning the shadows that surrounded them. Every rustling branch, every gust of wind, seemed like a potential threat. Claire, Ethan's voice trembled. What do we do now? Claire stopped and turned to him, her heart aching. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything was going to be fine, but she couldn't. Not when she felt the truth, the overwhelming certainty that whatever they had just experienced, whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with them. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. We have to keep moving, she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. We can't stop. We have to get far away from that place. Ethan nodded, his small face pale and drawn. He trusted her, but Claire could see the terror in his eyes, the way his small hands shook as they trudged through the snow. They walked for what seemed like an eternity, the storm growing fiercer with each passing moment. The road was now barely visible, the swirling snow creating an almost impenetrable wall around them. Claire squinted against the wind, her thoughts a blur as she tried to focus on the path ahead. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A flicker of movement, just a shadow, but it was enough to stop her cold. Her heart skipped a beat, and she grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him behind her instinctively. Stay close, Claire whispered, her voice tight with fear. They stood there for a moment, breathless, watching the darkness around them. The wind had died down for a moment, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if something, or someone, was watching them. The hairs on the back of Claire's neck stood up, and she felt that terrible chill creeping into her bones again. It wasn't the storm. Something was out there. Claire squinted into the distance. The snow was thickening again, but she could see the outline of something that wasn't supposed to be there. It was moving just at the edge of her vision, shifting in and out of the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to look again, but she had to. She needed to know what it was. The figure was tall, too tall, and its outline was jagged, unnatural. The shadows seemed to twist around it like smoke, pulling and stretching. It was a silhouette, a figure that didn't belong in the natural world. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get away before it noticed them, but she couldn't move. Her feet were frozen to the spot. She felt as though her body was being pulled toward the figure, as if it had an invisible grip on her. And then it happened. The figure moved toward them, its steps slow but deliberate. Each movement was smooth, almost graceful, despite the unnaturalness of its form. Its presence seemed to distort the air itself, warping reality as it approached. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something darker, something more sinister. Ethan whimpered beside her, his hand clutching hers. Claire could hear his breath hitching in his chest, and she could feel the panic rising in her own throat. She didn't want to face this. Not again. But they had no choice. There was nowhere to run. The figure stepped closer, and with every step, the temperature seemed to drop. The air around them turned to ice, biting and sharp. Claire could feel the cold sinking into her skin, freezing her from the inside out. It wasn't just physical. It was like the figure was draining the warmth from the very core of her being, leaving nothing but a hollow emptiness. And then it spoke. Asterisk, you can't escape, asterisk. The voice was familiar, but twisted, distorted. It was like hearing someone speak from the other side of a wall, muffled but clear enough to understand. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She had heard that voice before. She had heard it in the house, in the darkness, in her nightmares. It was the same voice, the same thing. I thought you left us, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was a cold, empty grin that stretched impossibly wide. The smile was not a smile at all. It was a grimace, a sign of something far worse. You can't leave, it said again, its voice carrying an unnatural finality. You're part of this now. Forever. Claire felt the ground shift beneath her feet. It wasn't just the snow. The earth itself seemed to tremble as if it were alive, as if it were responding to the figure's presence. The ground cracked, the air grew heavy with the scent of decay, and Claire felt herself being pulled, dragged toward the figure. We have to fight back, Ethan whispered, his voice full of fear. Claire turned to him, her eyes wide with panic. But it was too late. There was no fighting this thing. No escape. The figure reached out a hand toward her, its fingers long and clawed, the skin blackened and twisted. And then, in one final, chilling breath, it spoke its last words. Asterisk, midnight has come, asterisk. And in that moment, everything went dark. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the endless snow. The cold had seeped into her bones, making every step feel like a battle against her own body. Ethan clung to her, his small, fragile hand gripping hers with desperate urgency. She could feel his heart racing in his chest, thudding like a drumbeat in her ear. Claire, what was that? What is it? Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke, his eyes wide with fear, searching the darkness around them for answers. Claire didn't answer. How could she? How could she explain something that didn't make sense, something that had no place in their world? That thing, whatever it was, hadn't just spoken to them. It had invaded their very souls, twisting the world around them in ways that made her question everything she thought she knew. The cold, the shadows, the way reality itself had begun to bend and break. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer in the same place they had been before. But even more terrifying than the creature itself was the nagging question that wouldn't leave her mind. Why? Why them? Why now? They had made it this far. The road ahead was dark and treacherous, but they couldn't go back. The house was behind them, but she knew it wasn't the end. She could still feel its pull, like a dark magnet drawing her back to the place where it all began. Claire didn't want to admit it, but she could sense it now. The house wasn't just cursed. It had been the gateway. A doorway into something far worse. The shadow wasn't bound to the house. It was alive in ways that defied explanation. The wind howled around them, the snow swirling in violent gusts. But there was something different about the storm now. Something almost intentional. As if the storm itself was conspiring against them, trying to push them toward something. Toward it. Ethan tugged at her hand, his voice barely audible against the roaring wind. "I don't like it here, Claire. I want to go home." The word home sent a jolt of pain through Claire's chest. Home was no longer a safe place. She couldn't protect Ethan from whatever was chasing them. And she knew now that it wasn't just them. They weren't the only ones caught in this nightmare. The storm began to intensify, and the temperature seemed to plummet further, as though the very air was becoming alive with malice. The crunch of their footsteps in the snow was the only sound that dared to break the suffocating silence. The whispers had stopped for now, but they weren't gone. Claire felt them, lingering just beyond the edge of her hearing, curling around her like tendrils of cold, silent promises. As they walked, the world around them began to shift again. The trees that lined the road seemed to warp, their trunks bending at unnatural angles, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. The road itself began to buckle, the ground breaking apart in jagged cracks, as if the very earth beneath them was trying to swallow them whole. "Claire, I don't understand," Ethan said, his voice trembling with confusion. "Where are we going? What's happening?" She didn't know how to answer him. She didn't know how to explain that they were running in circles, that no matter how far they went, it was never far enough. That something was hunting them and there was nowhere to hide. "I don't know," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't stop. We have to keep moving." Just as she spoke, the ground beneath them shifted again. But this time it wasn't just the earth trembling. It was the world itself, shifting, bending, and breaking. Claire grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him closer as a deep rumble filled the air. The sky above them seemed to crack open, splitting in half with a deafening roar. The snow that had been falling steadily moments ago now seemed to freeze in midair, suspended in time. The world held its breath. And then, from the darkness beyond the trees, they heard it. A low, guttural growl, like the sound of a beast, deep and echoing, reverberating in the very air around them. The noise was close, closer than she cared to admit. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, coiling and twisting like serpents in the night. "Claire, what is it?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. She didn't have an answer. She couldn't give him one. Because she had a terrible feeling that whatever was coming wasn't just after them, it was after everything. The very fabric of reality seemed to be tearing apart, and they were caught in the center of it. And then they saw it. A figure, large and looming, stepping out from the darkness, its form barely visible at first. The snow seemed to part around it, as if the very storm was afraid to touch it. The creature was massive, its shape twisted and monstrous, an unnatural silhouette against the night. The shadows surrounding it rippled like liquid, as if the creature itself was made of darkness, its body shifting and warping with every movement. Its eyes, glowing red like embers, pierced the night, locking onto Claire and Ethan with an intensity that made her blood run cold. It stepped forward, the ground trembling beneath its weight. And then, just as it took another step, the world around them seemed to scream in agony. The earth cracked open, the sound of splintering rock filling the air as the shadows closed in on them. Claire could feel it, the pull, the overwhelming darkness that threatened to consume them both. She could feel her heart beating in her chest, pounding in time with the growls of the creature. There was nowhere left to run. There was no escape. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, its breath hot and putrid in the frozen air. It spoke, its voice a deep, rumbling growl that sent a shock of terror through Claire's body. "You are mine," it whispered, its voice a promise of doom. And now the real nightmare begins. Before Claire could react, the ground beneath them shattered, sending them both tumbling into the darkness below. The fall seemed to stretch on forever, the world spinning around them in a dizzying blur. Claire's heart was in her throat, the terror of falling into the darkness consuming her. She could hear Ethan's frantic cries as they plummeted into the abyss, his small hand clutching hers in a desperate grip. She tried to scream, but the air was stolen from her lungs. The sound of their descent was drowned out by the roar of the wind, the earth itself swallowing them whole. She couldn't see anything, just darkness, endless, suffocating darkness. Then suddenly the fall stopped. It wasn't a gradual halt, but a violent, jarring one. Claire's body slammed against the cold, hard ground with an almost bone-crushing force. Her breath was knocked out of her, and for a moment she could do nothing but lie there, dazed and gasping for air. Ethan's cry was the first thing she heard clearly. She scrambled to her feet, her body protesting the movement, and turned to him. He was on the ground next to her, trembling and wide-eyed, but alive. She reached out for him, her hands shaking as she pulled him into her arms. We're okay," Claire whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. She had no idea where they were or what had just happened, but she wasn't about to leave Ethan alone. The darkness around them was thick, so thick, it was as if they were buried beneath the earth itself. Claire could feel the weight of it pressing down on them, suffocating them. There was no light here, no warmth. Just the cold, oppressive void that seemed to stretch forever. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. She needed to think. They had fallen into something, into something. But what? It wasn't just another part of the world they had known. It wasn't just an accident. This place, it was different. Claire? Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. What is this place? Claire's hand tightened around his, pulling him closer as the fear in his voice rattled her. She looked around them, trying to make sense of the nothingness, but there was nothing to see. No walls, no ceiling, just an empty, dark expanse that stretched endlessly in every direction. "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But we have to find a way out. We can't stay here." Ethan clung to her tighter, his small body trembling. She could feel his fear, could taste it in the air around them. It made her heart ache. She hated seeing him like this, hated that she couldn't give him the comfort he needed. But there was nothing to comfort them here. The place was wrong, alive in some twisted way. She could feel it, like the darkness was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. She stood up slowly, pulling Ethan with her. Every movement felt too loud in the stillness of the void, as if they were drawing attention to themselves. As if whatever was lurking in the shadows was already aware of them, had been aware of them the moment they fell. "Where do we go?" Ethan whispered. Claire didn't know. She looked around again, but the darkness refused to reveal anything to her. The void was oppressive, suffocating. It felt like the air was thick with something alive, watching, breathing, waiting. The walls of this place seemed to press in on them with every second that passed, and Claire felt like she was losing herself in the weight of it. "Just stay close," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We have to keep moving. We can't stay in one place." They started walking. Every step felt wrong, like they were walking on something that didn't exist, like the ground beneath them could crumble away at any moment. But they had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. The darkness surrounded them, a constant reminder of the evil they had just escaped from. As they moved deeper into the void, Claire began to hear something, soft, almost imperceptible at first. A whisper. A distant murmur that seemed to come from all around them. She stopped dead in her tracks, holding Ethan tightly. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his face pale with fear. "What is it?" Claire listened harder. The sound was getting louder, a low, guttural noise that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath them. The air itself seemed to hum with it, sending a chill through her bones. "It's coming closer," Claire said, her voice trembling. She turned around, her heart racing in her chest. Then she saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a flicker, something moving at the edge of her vision. But then it grew, shifting in the darkness, a shape that was more than just a shadow. It was a thing, alive, moving, breathing. Its outline was jagged, twisted, like something that had never belonged in the world of light. Claire's pulse quickened as the shape moved toward them, slowly at first, but with a terrifying inevitability. The whispers grew louder, now indistinguishable from the growl of the creature. The ground shook as it moved, the darkness itself seeming to coil and stretch, reaching for them. No, Claire shouted, pulling Ethan back. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest as she turned and ran, pulling him with her. They didn't know where they were going. There was no path, no escape, just the endless, suffocating darkness. But they had to run. They had no choice. The ground beneath them began to tremble harder now, and Claire could hear the creature, closer, its growl vibrating in the very air around them. The whispers had turned into snarls, grating and harsh, and the shadows around them seemed to press in tighter with every step. Suddenly, a light flickered ahead, a small, faint glow in the distance. It was almost too faint to see, but it was there, beckoning them forward. Without thinking, Claire pulled Ethan toward it, the only hope they had. But as they ran, the creature's growl grew louder, more frantic, and the shadows seemed to reach out for them, trying to pull them back into the darkness. Claire, I don't want to die, Ethan sobbed, his voice breaking. We won't, Claire said fiercely, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. We're almost there. We have to keep going. The light was getting brighter now, but the creature wasn't far behind. Claire's heart raced in her chest, her legs burning with the effort to run. She pushed herself harder, pulling Ethan along with her, desperate to reach the light before it was too late. The ground cracked again, and Claire felt herself slip. She was falling into the abyss once more. But this time there was no cold air to greet her, no wind to catch her breath, just darkness. And then everything stopped. The fall didn't last long this time. The world around Claire and Ethan spun wildly, but it felt like time had slowed. The air rushed past her in a whispering roar, but there was something else now, something that wasn't just the sound of falling. It was the sound of something chasing them, a distant yet powerful thrum, like the beat of an enormous heart that echoed through the pit of the world. Claire's chest tightened. The sensation was almost suffocating, as though the very air was pressing in on her, heavy with dread. She reached out for Ethan in the darkness, feeling his small hand latch onto hers, gripping her tightly as they descended together. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat seeming to echo the deep hum that filled the space around them. She couldn't see anything, nothing but blackness. But she could feel something like an invisible force pulling at them, dragging them downward. Then, with a sickening thud, they hit the ground. Claire gasped, her breath catching in her throat as the impact sent jolts of pain through her body. She felt the shock reverberate through her spine, but somehow they had survived the fall. The darkness that surrounded them seemed thicker now, more suffocating. But at least they were no longer falling. Claire took a moment to steady herself, breathing deeply, trying to collect her thoughts. The world around them was silent, the oppressive hum gone, replaced by a heavy stillness. She could hear Ethan's panicked breath beside her, but in the depths of the darkness, it felt like they were utterly alone. The air was cold and damp, and the ground beneath them was soft, uneven, like they were lying on the edge of a vast pit. Ethan, she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. She reached out for him in the blackness, her hand finding his. Are you okay? There was a long pause before he answered, his voice shaky. I think so. But where are we? What is this place? Claire didn't have an answer. She didn't know where they were or how they had fallen. One moment they had been running toward the light, and the next they had been thrown into this place. The sensation of the fall was still fresh in her mind, and she could still feel the weight of the shadows pressing in on them. I don't know, Claire said finally, her voice tight. But we have to keep moving. We can't stay here. She stood up slowly, using her free hand to push herself off the cold, damp ground. Every step felt heavy, as though the earth beneath her was trying to drag her back into the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of decay, an overpowering stench that clung to everything. Stay close, she whispered to Ethan, pulling him up beside her. We need to find a way out. They began to move cautiously through the darkness. Claire tried to stay as calm as possible, though her mind was racing. They had been through so much already, but it felt like they were only getting deeper into whatever nightmare this was. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, closely, intensely. And the worst part? She didn't know who or what was watching them. The deeper they ventured, the heavier the air seemed to get. It felt as though the very fabric of reality was thinner here, like everything was breaking apart. Every sound they made, every footstep, every breath, was swallowed up by the oppressive void. Even their whispers seemed to vanish, leaving them in an eerie silence that made Claire's skin crawl. And then there it was, a flicker of light. Claire froze, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by fear. But no, there it was again, a faint, flickering glow in the distance, just beyond the reach of her vision. Do you see that? She whispered, her voice tight. Ethan nodded, his face pale with fear. Yeah. What is it? Claire didn't know, but she had a feeling that it was something they needed to reach. The darkness around them felt suffocating, and the light seemed like a beacon, a hope that maybe they could escape this place. She tugged Ethan forward, not waiting for a response. With each step, the light grew stronger, more distinct. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. It wasn't much longer before Claire could see the source of the light. At first, it seemed like a distant glow, like a candle burning in the dark. But as they drew closer, Claire realized it wasn't a flame at all. It was a figure. A tall, thin figure standing motionless in the center of a vast, empty space. The figure's outline was illuminated by the faint light, but Claire could make out very little else. It stood still, its back turned to them as though it was waiting for something, or someone. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the darkness that pressed in on them, or the cold that seemed to seep through her bones. No, this was different. This figure felt wrong. "Who are you?" Claire called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. The figure didn't move. "Do you need help?" Ethan's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. Still, there was no response. The figure remained motionless, as though it was frozen in time. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of them, aware of their every move, every breath. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving the figure. Something about it made her stomach turn, like it was pulling at her, drawing her in with some unseen force. And then the figure turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, as though it was finally acknowledging their presence. As it turned, the light around it seemed to pulse, growing brighter with every inch of the figure's motion. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the figure faced them, and she felt her heart stop. Its face was a mask of pale, smooth porcelain without any features. No eyes, no mouth, nothing but an expressionless surface staring at them. Asterisk, what do you want? Asterisk, Claire demanded, her voice shaking. The mask tilted slightly, almost as if considering her words. And then, without a sound, it reached out. Its arms stretched unnaturally long, fingers coming closer, closer. And suddenly, the world around Claire erupted into a rush of noise, a cacophony of whispers, growls, and screams that seemed to come from all directions. The light around the figure flickered and died, plunging them back into the oppressive darkness. The figure's outstretched hand closed in on her, but it wasn't fast enough. With all her strength, Claire pulled Ethan away, turning to run. But the darkness was everywhere. The figure was everywhere. And the light was gone. The darkness swallowed them whole. Claire could feel the ground beneath her feet shifting, the air thick with the sounds of their breath and the frantic pounding of her heart. Ethan's hand was still tightly gripped in hers, but she could barely make out his form in the suffocating blackness that surrounded them. The shadows seemed to move like liquid, slipping through the spaces between them, pressing in from all sides, tightening their grip with every passing second. The sound of her own breathing was deafening in the silence, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession. There was nothing to see but the oppressive void, and for a moment, Claire wasn't even sure if she was still standing on solid ground. She felt suspended in space, weightless, like the very essence of the world had been torn away from beneath her feet. "We need to get out of here," Claire muttered to herself, her voice barely more than a whisper. But even as she said it, she knew it was a useless thought. There was no out here, no escape. They were trapped in this dark, suffocating place, and the feeling that they were being watched, hunted, only grew stronger with every passing moment. The whispers returned. At first they were soft, too soft to be sure of. But now they grew louder, filling the space with an eerie hum that reverberated through her chest. They weren't just whispers. They were words. Broken, jagged words, indistinguishable at first, but as Claire strained her ears, she caught fragments. Words that felt wrong. Words that made her blood run cold. Asterisk, leave. Asterisk, came one voice, so faint Claire wasn't sure if it had even been real. Asterisk, why did you come? Asterisk, came another, much closer now. Claire's heart skipped a beat. Her grip on Ethan's hand tightened, pulling him closer to her side. Asterisk, who's there? Asterisk, she called out into the void. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast nothingness. There was no answer, only the eerie sound of the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, a sharp pain flared in Claire's chest, as though the air itself was cutting into her. She gasped, staggering back. Ethan cried out, but the sound was muffled, distant. Claire spun around, trying to locate him, her vision blurry as the pressure in her chest increased, suffocating her. Then there it was, a flash of movement in the corner of her eye. Just a flicker. But it was enough to make her freeze. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The figure was there again, the one with the porcelain mask. But it wasn't just standing this time. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately. Its elongated limbs seemed to bend and twist in ways that no human body could, the joints cracking with an unnerving sound that sent a chill through her spine. And the mask was alive. She could see it now, the smooth surface undulating, shifting, as though the mask itself was breathing, alive with some terrible, unknown force. It stepped closer, each movement sending a shiver of terror through Claire's body. She wanted to scream, to run, but the darkness seemed to wrap around her, its grip tightening, suffocating her in place. Asterisk, stay away from us. Asterisk, she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the surrounding whispers, which seemed to grow louder, angrier, as the figure advanced. The thing tilted its head as though considering her words, and then it took another step forward. Claire's blood ran cold as she watched it move, her every instinct screaming at her to run, to escape, but her legs felt rooted to the spot, her body frozen in terror. And then the whisper stopped. Silence. For a moment, it was as if the entire world had stopped, paused in time, and in that deafening stillness the figure took one more step forward. It was so close now, Claire could feel the cold emanating from its body, a chill that cut through her very bones. Her breath was ragged, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. And then it spoke. Asterisk, why do you persist? Asterisk, the voice was low, a hollow guttural sound that sent a shudder down Claire's spine. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, cold and mocking. Claire swallowed hard, her throat tight. She was trembling, every part of her body screaming for her to do something, anything, but she was paralyzed. The figure's presence, the way it seemed to distort the very air around them, made her feel as though she was being drawn into its gravity, caught in its pull. Asterisk, we didn't mean to come here, asterisk, Claire managed to say, her voice trembling. Asterisk, we just need to get out, asterisk. The figure's mask seemed to ripple in response, like a laugh held beneath the surface. It tilted its head again, slowly, unnervingly. Asterisk, escape. Asterisk, it said, its voice dripping with disdain. Asterisk, there is no escape, asterisk. The word sent a shockwave of panic through Claire's chest. There was no escape? No escape? The figure's hand reached out slowly, its long skeletal fingers stretching toward her, its grip cold and inexorable. Claire's heart raced in terror. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Ethan's small voice cut through her panic. Asterisk, Mom, please don't let it get us, asterisk. His words hit Claire like a slap to the face. Asterisk, this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Ethan too, asterisk, she had to protect him. She had to get him out of here no matter what. With every ounce of strength she had left, Claire yanked Ethan away, stumbling back. Her breath was coming in shallow gasps, the terror clawing at her insides as the figure stepped forward, its hands still reaching, its movements slow but inevitable. Asterisk, don't let it touch you, asterisk, Claire gasped, pulling Ethan with her as she turned and ran, the figure's mocking voice ringing in the darkness behind them. But as they ran, the darkness seemed to twist around them, warping, stretching, the air itself becoming thick and oppressive. The ground beneath their feet seemed to buckle and crack with each step, as though the very space they were in was alive, shifting, closing in on them. There was no way out. The void was endless. The figure was relentless. And Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse than just the figure was waiting for them ahead. The ground was trembling beneath Claire's feet as she and Ethan sprinted through the suffocating dark. The whispers had returned, now louder, more urgent. Every corner of the abyss seemed to hum with malicious intent, the very air charged with a sense of looming dread. Claire could feel it. This wasn't just some place they had fallen into. This wasn't just darkness. It was alive. It was aware. She glanced over at Ethan, his small face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He clung to her side, struggling to keep up, but Claire's heart ached with the knowledge that she couldn't protect him from the things lurking in the dark. She wasn't sure if she could protect herself. The echoes of their footsteps were the only sounds in the crushing silence, but it didn't last long. The air grew colder, sharper, as though an invisible force was closing in on them from all sides, tightening its grip. Claire's breath came in short, panicked bursts as her muscles screamed with exhaustion. She had no idea where she was running anymore or what she was running from. All she knew was that there was no place to hide here. No place to escape. Suddenly the whispers stopped again. Not the eerie, subtle murmurings from before, but a dead silence, one that felt even worse. The oppressive air that had been pressing in on them seemed to evaporate, replaced by a thick, tangible stillness. It was too quiet. Far too quiet. Claire stopped in her tracks, pulling Ethan to a halt beside her. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat, every sense on high alert. She didn't dare breathe too loudly, didn't dare move too quickly. There was something here. Something was watching them. The darkness around them shifted, just a flicker at first, but Claire caught it. Her skin prickled as if 1,000 unseen eyes were turning toward them. What is it, Mom? Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. What's happening? Claire didn't answer right away. She didn't know. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation they found themselves in. It felt as though the very fabric of reality had begun to fray, unraveling bit by bit, and she and Ethan were stuck in the middle of it. Nothing made sense. Nothing could make sense. But then the ground beneath them shifted again, this time more violently. It was as if the very earth they stood on was being torn apart. Claire gasped, staggering to the side as the floor cracked open in a wide chasm. Ethan screamed, but Claire barely had time to react. With a single motion, she grabbed his arm, yanking him away from the edge just as the earth splintered further, threatening to swallow them both. They scrambled back, hearts racing, hands trembling. The chasm opened wider, the crack expanding like a mouth that was about to devour them. Claire could feel it, a terrible magnetic pull from the depths below, as though the very ground wanted to drag them into the abyss. What's happening? Claire whispered to herself. She felt as though the world was slipping away, like they were being erased, pulled into something far worse than any nightmare. The terror was overwhelming, paralyzing. Every instinct told her to run, but where could she run to? There was nowhere left. The air thickened again, pressing down on her chest. She wanted to scream, but her voice failed her. The crack in the earth continued to grow, spreading out like a spider's web, a sign of something ancient, something deeply wrong, reaching out to claim them. And then, without warning, a voice echoed from the darkness. It was deep, no, too deep, like it came from somewhere far below, beneath the very ground they stood on. You cannot outrun what you've awakened, The words were slow, deliberate, and laced with an undeniable finality. Claire's blood ran cold. She felt like her soul had been sucked out of her body with those words, leaving her empty and trembling. Her body wanted to collapse, but somehow she managed to stay upright, holding on to Ethan for dear life. But the voice continued, its tone colder now, with an undercurrent of mockery. You thought you could escape the darkness? You thought you could defy fate? You cannot. You will never escape, Claire's legs shook beneath her, but she forced herself to move, stepping away from the growing chasm. She had to do something. They couldn't stay here. She couldn't let the darkness swallow them. But no matter how far they moved, the ground seemed to split further. The darkness around them thickened, folding in on itself, surrounding them on all sides, suffocating them, threatening to close in for good. Then, as if on cue, a light flickered into existence. It was faint, barely visible at first, but Claire's heart skipped a beat. There, through the inky blackness, a small, pale light shone in the distance, like a candle flickering in the wind. But this wasn't just any light. It felt different. It felt alive. It pulsed with an energy that Claire couldn't quite comprehend, an energy that felt dangerous, yet enticing. Look, Mom? Ethan gasped, his eyes wide with wonder. What is that? Claire didn't answer him. She was too focused on the light. It was a sign. It had to be. The only other option was the dark, the chasm beneath them, and the voice that threatened to pull them into oblivion. But something gnawed at her, a warning deep in her gut. This light wasn't just a way out. It was a trap. She could feel it in her bones. And yet, she couldn't turn away from it. She couldn't ignore the pull. Stay close to me, Claire whispered to Ethan, grabbing his hand tightly. We're going toward the light, but we need to be careful, They began walking toward the light. With every step, the shadows seemed to retreat, pulling back like a tide that had reached its limit. But even as the light grew brighter, Claire felt the temperature drop. The air grew frigid, biting into her skin. She could see her breath now, a cloud of mist in the frozen air. The light was closer now, so close she could make out its form. It wasn't a candle at all, but something far more terrifying. The light seemed to come from a figure, a humanoid figure cloaked in tattered robes, its face obscured by a veil of shadow. What is this? Claire whispered, her heart pounding. The figure raised its head, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. Beneath the veil of shadow there was no face, only emptiness, a void darker than the night surrounding them. And then the voice again, this time closer, more present, more real. You've come for it, The figure's hand extended toward her, its fingers long and skeletal, its movements slow and deliberate. It beckoned her forward, its voice softer now, almost soothing. But Claire could feel the danger in those words. The darkness beneath them, the void that reached out for them, was beginning to stir again, its presence growing more insistent. Come to me, the voice whispered. Claire felt a rush of panic. She didn't know what to do anymore. The chasm at her back was closing in, the voice that had taunted them now a constant buzz in her ears, and this figure with its empty face and beckoning hand, it was the only thing in front of them now. But it wasn't an answer. It wasn't salvation. It was more like another trap, another part of the nightmare they couldn't escape. With every instinct screaming at her to run, Claire did the only thing she could do. She pulled Ethan away. No, Ethan. Not this way, She turned on her heel, yanking him back toward the dark that still surrounded them. But the figure didn't let go. The darkness was closing in again. Claire's pulse raced in her ears as she jerked Ethan back from the figure's reach. He stumbled, but she held him close, her fingers locked around his arm with a desperation that made her fingertips ache. They couldn't stay here. Not with that thing so close. The light, the figure, it was all part of a twisted game, and they were its next victims. Run, Claire whispered urgently, her voice shaky. There was no time to second-guess herself. They had to go. No. But as they turned to move, the world around them shifted. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with a low hum that reverberated through Claire's bones. The air grew heavy, thick with a palpable presence, as though the very space around them was alive, watching, waiting. The whispers had returned, now louder, more frenzied, swirling around them like a swarm of insects. And just like that, the world tilted. The ground beneath their feet buckled, sending them both tumbling forward into an inky abyss. Claire gasped, her heart leaping into her throat, as the world around her spun out of control. She reached out, grasping at Ethan, but her fingers only found air. The darkness enveloped her, swallowing her whole. Her body slammed against something hard, stone maybe, and she gasped for breath, her chest constricted with panic. It took her a moment to gather herself, but when she opened her eyes, everything had changed. The familiar darkness was gone, replaced by an eerie, sterile light. For a moment, Claire thought she was imagining things. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized that she wasn't alone. They were in a room. A small, windowless room, its walls cold and unyielding. There were no doors, no visible exits. Just bare, gray stone, and the dim, unnatural light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. Ethan was beside her, looking just as lost as she felt. His wide eyes were darting around the room, his lips trembling, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't. There was nothing to say. Claire's thoughts were racing too fast for her to process, but one thing was clear. They were not alone. There was something in the room with them. Claire's skin prickled, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as she slowly turned her head. The walls were covered in strange, jagged marks, lines and symbols carved into the stone with such precision that they almost seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The air was thick with a heavy, stagnant scent, something like damp earth mixed with something far worse, something darker. And then she heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, as though it was coming from the very walls themselves. A voice, but not a human one. It was something ancient. Something that had been waiting for centuries, perhaps longer. You have wandered too far, the voice rasped. It was everywhere, in every corner of the room, in every crack in the walls, in the very air Claire breathed. The voice echoed in her skull, vibrating her bones, wrapping around her like a suffocating coil. She tried to speak, but her mouth felt dry, her throat constricted. All she could do was clutch Ethan to her side and take one slow step backward. And then the room seemed to tilt again. The walls cracked open and Claire's heart stopped. She blinked, disoriented, as the stone walls shifted, the jagged marks on them bleeding into the room. The symbols twisted and curled like dark tendrils, stretching across the stone with an unnatural speed. The voice came again, but this time it was louder. Closer. You have been chosen, it growled. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt like lead, unable to move. There was a pressure building around her chest, a sense of impending doom that threatened to crush her. Ethan clung to her side, but even he could feel it, the unbearable weight of the presence that was closing in on them. She couldn't explain it, but she knew one thing for sure. They weren't supposed to be here. They had walked right into the heart of whatever this was, and there would be no leaving. The symbols on the walls were moving now, shifting like serpents in the shadows. They were alive and they were watching them. Claire forced herself to take a breath, her hands trembling as she looked around the room once more, desperately searching for something, anything that could help them escape. That's when she saw it. A door. Small, almost hidden, tucked away in the far corner of the room. It was barely visible, the edges faded as though it didn't belong there at all. But it was there, and it was their only chance. She grabbed Ethan's hand and began to move toward it, dragging him behind her, but the air seemed to thicken with each step. The walls groaned, the ground beneath their feet trembling as if it were about to swallow them whole. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around them, pressing in on all sides, as though the very room was alive with a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. Leave, the voice again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper, it was a command. It was an order. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as she reached the door. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her fingers trembled, the cold metal biting into her skin as she twisted the knob, pulling with all her might. Nothing. Then she heard something. A faint scraping noise like nails dragging across stone. The sound was coming from the other side of the room. And then it stepped into view. The figure. It was tall, taller than anything Claire had seen before, and its form seemed to shimmer in the unnatural light. The air around it was thick, heavier, as though reality itself bent in its presence. Its skin was dark, almost black like stone. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were empty sockets, hollow and vast, staring at Claire with an intensity that froze her blood. Its mouth stretched open, impossibly wide as it began to speak. But this time, the voice wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the figure itself. You cannot escape, The word sent a wave of pure terror crashing over Claire. She staggered back, her hands still on the door, but her feet were rooted to the ground. She couldn't look away from the thing before her. It was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong, unnatural, a thing that didn't belong in the world. You are mine now, it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. There is nowhere left for you to hide, Claire felt the weight of those words pressing in on her, suffocating her, until her breath came in ragged gasps. She had to act. She had to do something, anything, before it was too late. The figure reached out a hand, the fingers elongating impossibly, and Claire's heart nearly stopped as she saw the claws that gleamed in the dim light. She grabbed Ethan's hand and yanked him toward the door once more, but it was no use. The door wouldn't open. They were trapped, and the figure was closing in. The figure's hand stretched forward, claws gleaming like jagged, sharpened obsidian. Claire's heart raced so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. She instinctively yanked Ethan toward her, her grip tightening around his hand, but the door, still locked, stood like an impenetrable wall between them and whatever nightmare was now bearing down on them. The thing, the creature, loomed closer, its black eyes empty voids of nothingness, watching them with an intensity that made Claire's skin crawl. The air grew colder, like a heavy blanket of ice settling over them. She could feel the space around them shrinking, suffocating her, the walls of the room pressing in, as though the very structure of this place was alive with an insatiable hunger. Mom? Ethan's voice cracked, breaking through Claire's thoughts. Mom, we're gonna die, aren't we? She couldn't answer him. Not in words. Because somewhere deep down she knew that this was it. This was the end of the road. There was no escape. No way out. Only the darkness that awaited them. The figure's movement was slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before its final strike. Each step it took caused the floor beneath their feet to groan, as if it were being crushed under the weight of its presence. Claire turned to the door again, panic clawing at her chest. The handle, still unmoving, still locked, mocked her. She slammed her hand against it in desperation, but it wouldn't give. And the thing behind them? It didn't care. It was patient, waiting, savoring the fear that radiated off of them. Please? Claire whispered, barely audible, as if pleading with the room itself. But nothing changed. The creature was almost upon them now, its long, gnarled fingers reaching out with malevolent precision. You cannot hide, it hissed in a voice that was not human, a voice that scraped against her ears like nails on glass. You are mine. Her mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, that could save them. But all she could feel was the crushing weight of hopelessness settling over her. Her mind felt sluggish, her thoughts distorted by fear. And then she felt it. A coldness so sharp it took her breath away, not just in the air but in her bones. It wasn't just the atmosphere anymore, it was as if the very walls themselves were closing in inch by agonizing inch. Ethan whimpered next to her, his grip on her hand tightening in fear. Claire's vision blurred for a second. She was dizzy. But then she heard it. A faint sound. At first it was like a distant hum, too quiet to understand. But as it grew louder, Claire's eyes widened in recognition. The sound was familiar. A sound that shouldn't be here. A sound that had been with them from the very beginning. The whispers. The whispers had never truly stopped. They had been there all along, buried beneath the fear and the chaos, like a constant presence in the back of Claire's mind. Now they seemed to be building to a crescendo, rising in intensity, a sound that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. A force of nature pulling her in. But as she focused on the whispers, something changed. The air grew heavier. The room seemed to shimmer like a mirage, flickering in and out of focus. The walls, the floor, the creature that was now only a few feet away, it was all starting to warp, to bend. This wasn't real. At least that's what Claire's mind told her. And in that moment of clarity she realized she had been here before. Not physically, not in this place, but in a dream. A nightmare. A vision. It clicked. The whispers were not just the sound of fear. They were not the product of her mind unraveling under the weight of terror. No, the whispers were a signal. A warning. And that figure, it was not the real threat. The true threat was something much older. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting, watching, for someone to finally awaken it. Claire stepped back, her legs trembling with the effort. She pulled Ethan closer, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The figure reached forward, its long fingers outstretched, but Claire was already moving. Asterisk run. Asterisk, she shouted, the words tumbling from her mouth before she even realized she'd spoken them. But before they could move, a low rumble shook the ground. The walls trembled again, cracking open in places as if the room itself were coming undone. And the whispers? They intensified. They were no longer whispers. They were voices. Thousands, millions, all speaking in unison, chanting, demanding, asterisk calling star. The figure's head tilted at an unnatural angle. It paused. The room froze. For one terrifying moment, everything was still. Then the creature stepped back. The door in front of them, it opened. The light on the other side was blinding. It wasn't the soft, sickly glow that had surrounded them before. It was real. It was pure. But there was something unsettling about it, something wrong, like it was both salvation and doom. Asterisk go asterisk, the voice that had haunted them, the voice from the walls, spoke softly now, like a faint whisper in the wind. But there was power in it. The same power that had pulled them into this nightmare to begin with. Claire didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for Ethan to ask questions or for her mind to second-guess herself. She grabbed his hand and bolted for the door. As they rushed toward it, the air thickened again, heavy with the presence of the creature. It let out a low, guttural growl, almost frustrated, as if it couldn't let them go. But the door remained open. And as Claire and Ethan passed through it, she heard one last thing. Asterisk, you will be back, asterisk. The voice wasn't threatening this time. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. And with that, the door slammed shut behind them. The world around them exploded into light, blinding and pure. It felt like the end. It felt like the beginning. But it didn't matter. They were free. For now. The blinding light slowly dimmed, and Claire's vision began to clear. She squinted, trying to adjust to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. She blinked rapidly as if waking from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, but it was real. They were no longer in that room. No longer surrounded by the twisting walls and suffocating whispers. They were outside. The cold night air hit her like a slap to the face. She could feel it biting at her skin, the crisp wind cutting through her clothes, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt alive. Free. Claire turned to Ethan, her eyes wide with disbelief. The world around them was peaceful, silent. Snowflakes drifted gently from the sky, each one falling softly to the ground like a delicate promise of calm. It was almost beautiful, like nothing had ever happened. Like they had never been trapped, never been hunted by a dark force they didn't understand. Ethan looked at her, his face pale and full of confusion but also relief. He didn't speak, but his eyes asked the question that Claire's heart was begging for the answer to. Are we really free? She didn't know. Not for sure. Are we okay? He whispered, his voice trembling. Claire nodded slowly, but there was doubt in her heart. Something felt off. The world was too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. For them. She looked around, her eyes scanning the landscape, searching for any sign of danger, any hint that the nightmare might still be lurking just out of sight. But everything was still. Too still. I don't know, Ethan, she murmured. I don't know if we're safe. Her words hung in the air, heavier than the snowflakes falling around them. As they began to walk forward, Claire's thoughts kept racing. Her mind was a blur of memories, flickers of that strange, dark room, of the figure, the whispers. That promise. You will be back. She couldn't shake it. The voice echoed in her ears, lingering in the corners of her mind like a haunting refrain. There was a finality to it, but also a sense of inevitability. It's not over. They walked for what seemed like hours, but the landscape never changed. The snow fell silently, the cold growing more intense, but there was still no sign of life. No sounds of cars, no streetlights in the distance. Just an endless expanse of white. It felt like they were trapped in a snow globe, frozen in time, unable to escape the eerie silence. And then Claire saw it. In the distance, just beyond the horizon, a shadow loomed. It was hard to make out at first, just a dark shape against the whiteness of the snow. But as they drew closer, it became clearer. A figure. Tall, dark, unmoving. The same figure that had haunted them. That had stalked them from the moment they stepped into that twisted room. Claire froze. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Do you see that? Ethan's head snapped to the same spot, his face draining of color. What is that? I don't know, Claire stammered, her heart pounding in her chest. But we need to go back. Now. Her legs began to move on their own. She grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him with her, but the figure didn't move. It didn't advance. It just stood there, its presence so palpable, so suffocating that Claire felt it in her bones. It was waiting. Waiting for them to make the first move. The cold wind whipped around them, sending a chill through Claire's spine. She looked back once more, but there was no escape. The figure was always there, always watching. Asterisk, you will be back, asterisk. The words returned to her ears, louder now, more distinct. And as she glanced down at Ethan, her heart sank. This wasn't the end. She wanted to scream, wanted to shout at the world that she didn't want this, that they couldn't keep running. But her voice caught in her throat. Claire felt the weight of the moment crash over her. She had thought they had escaped. She had thought they had outrun it. But the truth was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. Whatever it wasn't something that could be outrun. It wasn't something that could be left behind. The figure was still standing in the distance, unmoving, its presence suffocating everything around them. The whispers came again, this time louder than ever, filling the air with their promise. And just as Claire thought she couldn't take it any longer, just as she thought she might break under the weight of it all, she heard a voice that wasn't hers, that wasn't Ethan's. It was the voice of someone else. Asterisk, you cannot escape, asterisk. Claire spun around, her heart pounding as the figure stepped forward, its form shifting, its features becoming clearer in the snow's dim light. But this time it wasn't just the one figure. It was many. And they were closing in. Story 4. The frost-coated town of Hearthstone lay silent under a starless sky, its festive cheer frozen in time. Christmas lights blinked rhythmically, casting eerie shadows that danced across empty streets. The scent of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air, but tonight, it wasn't the season's joy that filled the town. It was something far darker. Mom, he's back, Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she peeked through the frosted window. Her tiny fingers clutched the curtains tightly, her breath fogging the glass. Clara looked up from the Christmas cookies she'd been icing. She forced a smile, though a knot twisted in her stomach. It's just your imagination, sweetheart. No one's out there. Emily shook her head, her wide eyes fixed on the shadows outside. No, Mom. It's him. The man in the red coat. The cookie slipped from Clara's hand, shattering on the tiled floor. She glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. Her husband Mark was still out, fetching wood from the shed. He should have been back an hour ago. Clara walked over to the window and pulled the curtains aside. At first she saw nothing. just the swirling snowflakes illuminated by the street lamp. And then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of their yard. Tall, motionless, wrapped in a tattered red coat. Her breath hitched. "Emily, go upstairs." "But Mom?" "Now?" Clara's voice was sharper than she intended. Emily hesitated but obeyed, her small footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. Clara locked the door and double-checked the windows, her hands trembling. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mark. No answer. She called again. Voicemail. "Where are you?" she whispered. The figure outside hadn't moved. It just stood there, its face obscured by the hood of the coat. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept down Clara's spine. She stepped back from the window, clutching her chest. She had heard stories. Old tales whispered around town about the man who came every Christmas Eve. The man who watched. The man who waited. The legends were just that, right? Stories to scare kids into staying inside. But now, staring at the figure in her yard, she wasn't so sure. A loud bang echoed from the back of the house. Clara spun around, her heart pounding. "Mark?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. She grabbed a fireplace poker and moved cautiously toward the sound. The kitchen door swung gently on its hinges, snowflakes scattering across the floor. And then she saw it. Boot prints. Large, heavy, leading from the back door into the house. "Mark, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," she said, her voice shaking. She stepped into the kitchen, her grip tightening on the poker. The boot prints led to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. The faint sound of humming drifted up from below. Her chest tightened. That wasn't Mark's voice. "Emily?" she called out, backing away toward the stairs. "Mom?" Emily's scream cut through the air, sharp and terrified. Clara dropped the poker and ran up the stairs two at a time. Emily's room was empty. The window was wide open, snow blowing in. A single red mitten lay on the floor. "Emily?" Clara yelled, leaning out the window. The figure in the red coat was gone, and so was her daughter. The frost-coated town of Hearthstone lay silent under a starless sky, its festive cheer frozen in time. Christmas lights blinked rhythmically, casting eerie shadows that danced across empty streets. The scent of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air, but tonight, it wasn't the season's joy that filled the town. It was something far darker. "Mom, he's back," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she peeked through the frosted window. Her tiny fingers clutched the curtains tightly, her breath fogging the glass. Clara looked up from the Christmas cookies she'd been icing. She forced a smile, though a knot twisted in her stomach. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart. No one's out there." Emily shook her head, her wide eyes fixed on the shadows outside. "No, Mom. It's him. The man in the red coat." The cookie slipped from Clara's hand, shattering on the tiled floor. She glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. Her husband Mark was still out, fetching wood from the shed. He should have been back an hour ago. Clara walked over to the window and pulled the curtains aside. At first she saw nothing. Just the swirling snowflakes illuminated by the street lamp. And then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of their yard. Tall, motionless, wrapped in a tattered red coat. Her breath hitched. "Emily, go upstairs." "But Mom?" "Now?" Clara's voice was sharper than she intended. Emily hesitated but obeyed, her small footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. Clara locked the door and double-checked the windows, her hands trembling. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mark. No answer. She called again. Voicemail. "Where are you?" she whispered. The figure outside hadn't moved. It just stood there, its face obscured by the hood of the coat. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept down Clara's spine. She stepped back from the window, clutching her chest. She had heard stories. Old tales whispered around town about the man who came every Christmas Eve. The man who watched. The man who waited. The legends were just that, right? Stories to scare kids into staying inside. But now, staring at the figure in her yard, she wasn't so sure. A loud bang echoed from the back of the house. Clara spun around, her heart pounding. "Mark?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. She grabbed a fireplace poker and moved cautiously toward the sound. The kitchen door swung gently on its hinges, snowflakes scattering across the floor. And then she saw it. Boot prints. Large, heavy, leading from the back door into the house. "Mark, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," she said, her voice shaking. She stepped into the kitchen, her grip tightening on the poker. The boot prints led to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. The faint sound of humming drifted up from below. Her chest tightened. That wasn't Mark's voice. "Emily?" she called out, backing away toward the stairs. "Mom?" Emily's scream cut through the air, sharp and terrified. Clara dropped the poker and ran up the stairs 2 at a time. Emily's room was empty. The window was wide open, snow blowing in. A single red mitten lay on the floor. "Emily!" Clara yelled, leaning out the window. The figure in the red coat was gone, and so was her daughter. Clara's scream echoed into the night, swallowed by the cold wind. Her hands trembled as she gripped the window frame, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. The snow outside was unbroken. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. "Emily!" she called again, her voice cracking. Silence answered her. She bolted back downstairs, snatching her coat from the hook by the door. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, but she finally managed to pull the door open. The icy wind hit her like a slap, but she didn't care. "Emily!" she screamed into the empty night. And then, just as she stepped into the yard, she saw it. A small, red mitten hanging from a low branch of the pine tree in their front yard. Her stomach lurched. That was Emily's mitten, the same one she'd bought her last Christmas. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she approached the tree. As she reached for the mitten, a soft sound froze her in place. Humming. It came from somewhere behind her. Low and steady, the same tune she'd heard earlier from the basement. Clara spun around, but there was nothing there. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice wavering. "Where's my daughter?" The humming stopped. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, darting between the houses across the street. Clara's eyes followed it, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. The figure in the red coat was back, standing under the street lamp again. This time it was holding something. Clara squinted, the light making it hard to see clearly. Her blood turned to ice when she realized what it was: a doll. Emily's favorite doll, the one she'd tucked under her arm when she went to bed. Her knees nearly gave out, but she forced herself to stay upright. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice breaking. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if considering her question. Then, without warning, it turned and began walking down the street, its steps deliberate and slow. Clara hesitated for only a moment before following. She couldn't feel her feet in the snow, couldn't hear anything but the rush of blood in her ears. "Emily!" she yelled again, but the figure didn't stop. It disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a trail of faint footprints. Clara ran, her breath visible in the freezing air. As she turned the corner, she saw the figure again, standing at the entrance of the town's old church. The church had been abandoned for years, its doors locked and windows boarded up. No one went there, not since the fire that had killed the previous caretaker decades ago. But now the doors were open, creaking gently in the wind. The figure slipped inside without a sound. Clara hesitated at the bottom of the steps. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to call the police, to do anything but follow. But then she heard it. "Mommy?" It was faint, barely audible, but it was Emily's voice. Clara's body moved before her mind could catch up. She climbed the steps, her hand trembling as she pushed the heavy wooden door open. The inside of the church was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of ash and decay. "Emily?" Clara called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. A single candle flickered to life at the far end of the room, casting a faint glow. Clara squinted, her heart pounding as she stepped closer. The candle sat on a small table, and beside it was something that made her knees buckle. Emily's scarf. Clara reached for it, her fingers brushing the fabric. It was still warm. "Mommy?" The voice came again, louder this time. Clara spun around, but the room was empty. "Emily, where are you?" she cried. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening thud. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the table. The candle flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. And then she saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, their outlines barely visible in the dim light. They stood in the pews, motionless, their heads all tilted at the same unnatural angle. The figures stood like statues, their presence suffocating the air in the church. Clara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stay upright. Her eyes darted from one shadowy figure to another, trying to discern faces, expressions, anything human. But there was nothing. Just the faint glimmer of candlelight reflecting off their motionless forms. "Emily?" Clara whispered, clutching the scarf tighter in her trembling hands. One of the figures moved. The sound was faint, like dry leaves brushing against each other, but it was enough to send Clara's heart racing. The figure stepped forward, its jerky, unnatural movements making it seem like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "Where is my daughter?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking but firm. The figure tilted its head, the motion deliberate and slow. It raised a hand, pointing toward the altar. Clara turned her gaze, her stomach twisting into knots. There, lying on the altar, was Emily. Her daughter's small body was motionless, her pale face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the scarf and ran toward the altar, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty church. "Emily," she cried, her voice breaking. But as she approached, the figures moved again. They surged forward as one, surrounding Clara in a tight circle. Their sudden movement was swift and coordinated, a stark contrast to their earlier stiffness. Clara stopped in her tracks, gripping the fireplace poker she had instinctively brought with her. "Get away from me," she yelled, swinging the poker wildly. The figures didn't flinch. They stood just out of reach, their dark forms shifting and swaying like shadows caught in a breeze. And then one of them spoke. It wasn't a voice, it was a rasp, dry and guttural, like wind through dead leaves. "She belongs to us now." Clara's blood ran cold. "No," she screamed. "You can't have her." She lunged toward the altar, but the figures blocked her path. Their hands were cold as ice as they grabbed her arms, pulling her back. Clara thrashed against them, her screams echoing off the church walls. "Emily, wake up!" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. Emily stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, but something was wrong. Her gaze was empty, her pupils as dark as the void surrounding them. "Mommy?" Emily's voice was faint, barely audible over Clara's pounding heart. "Yes, baby, I'm here," Clara sobbed. "I'm going to get you out of here." The figure in the red coat stepped forward, its presence commanding. In its gloved hands, it held Emily's doll. It placed the doll on the altar beside the little girl, then turned its faceless gaze toward Clara. "You were warned," it rasped, its voice echoing in the stillness. Clara shook her head. "No, please. I didn't know. I didn't. You broke the pact." The words hit her like a physical blow. Clara's mind raced. The stories. The warnings passed down through the generations. The man in the red coat who came every Christmas Eve. The families who disappeared, their homes left empty, their names erased from memory. It had been real. All of it. "I'll do anything," Clara pleaded, falling to her knees. "Take me instead. Just let her go." The figures seemed to hesitate, their forms shifting and flickering like candlelight. The man in the red coat stepped closer, looming over Clara. "The choice was made," it said. "The child is ours." "No," Clara screamed, lunging forward. She grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her off the altar. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The figures stood still, their dark forms looming like statues. Clara held Emily close, her daughter's small body warm against her chest. And then the candle went out. Darkness engulfed the church, thick and impenetrable. Clara couldn't see, couldn't breathe. She clutched Emily tighter, her heart pounding in her ears. "Mommy, I'm scared," Emily whispered. "Sure, it's okay, baby. I'm here," Clara said, her voice trembling. A low, guttural laugh echoed in the darkness, sending shivers down Clara's spine. "You cannot escape," the voice said, its tone dripping with malice. "She is ours, and so are you." The darkness seemed to close in, pressing against Clara from all sides. She stumbled backward, clutching Emily. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The church was empty. The figures were gone. The door creaked open, revealing the snow-covered street outside. Clara staggered to her feet, holding Emily tightly. She ran out of the church, not daring to look back. As they reached their house, Clara locked the door and collapsed on the floor, holding Emily close. "It's over," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Emily looked up at her, her dark eyes glinting in the dim light. "Is it, Mommy?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. Clara's breath caught. Emily smiled, a slow, chilling smile that wasn't hers. The sound of humming filled the room once more. Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The smile on Emily's face was wrong, twisted, unfamiliar, like a mask worn by someone pretending to be her daughter. "Emily?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head, much like the figures in the church. The soft, haunting hum continued, growing louder and echoing through the house. Clara stood, backing away from her daughter. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave Emily, not like this. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, her voice breaking. "What did you do to my daughter?" Emily's head straightened, and for a moment, her expression softened. "Mommy, it's me," she said, her voice small and pleading. "Don't you believe me?" Tears filled Clara's eyes. It was Emily's voice, her tone, but something still felt off. The humming hadn't stopped. It grew louder, more insistent, as if mocking her hesitation. "Prove it," Clara said, clutching the fireplace poker like a lifeline. "Prove you're my Emily." Emily's eyes gleamed. "You sang to me every night when I couldn't sleep. You held me when I was scared of the thunder. You always say, 'My brave girl can face anything.'" Clara's chest tightened. Those were things only Emily would know. She lowered the poker slightly, her resolve wavering. "Emily?" But then Emily smiled again, that same unnatural, chilling grin. "And you made a promise you couldn't keep," she said, her voice shifting, becoming deeper, layered with something inhuman. Clara's breath caught. "Mommy, you should have listened," Emily, or the thing wearing her face, said. "Now it's too late." The humming reached a crescendo, vibrating through the walls and floor. Clara stumbled, clutching her head as the sound became unbearable. "Stop it," she screamed, falling to her knees. The room grew darker, the shadows pooling around Emily as if they were alive. Clara's vision blurred, her thoughts racing. She couldn't lose her daughter, not like this. Summoning every ounce of courage, she reached for Emily. "You're still in there," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I won't let them take you." For a moment, the humming faltered. Emily's eyes flickered, the darkness receding ever so slightly. "Mommy," she said, her voice small and frightened. Clara seized the moment, pulling her daughter into her arms. "I've got you," she whispered. "I won't let them have you." But the darkness surged back, stronger than before. Emily screamed, her body convulsing as the shadows wrapped around her, pulling her away from Clara. "No," Clara yelled, holding on with all her strength. "You can't have her." A cold, guttural laugh filled the room. "She was ours the moment you let us in," the voice said. Clara's mind raced. Let them in. What had she done? She thought back to the evening, the cookies, the decorations, the old stories. The stories always warned about keeping the hearth lit, about never inviting the man in the red coat. And then she realized her mistake. The back door. She hadn't locked it. Clara's heart sank as the truth hit her. She had broken the ancient rules, and now they were here to collect. But she wasn't giving up. Not yet. Clara closed her eyes, focusing on Emily's voice, her laughter, every memory she could cling to. "You can't take her," she said through gritted teeth. "She's mine." The shadows hesitated, flickering like a flame in the wind. The laughter faltered, replaced by a growl of frustration. "You don't understand," the voice hissed. "You can't save her." Clara opened her eyes, staring into the darkness. "Watch me," she said, her voice steady. Summoning all her strength, she pulled Emily close and screamed, a primal, desperate sound that echoed through the house. The shadows recoiled, writhing and twisting as if in pain. The humming stopped. Emily gasped, her body going limp in Clara's arms. The darkness receded, fading into nothingness, leaving the room eerily silent. Clara held her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "I've got you." Emily stirred, her small hand clutching Clara's coat. "Mommy," she said, her voice weak but normal. Clara sobbed in relief, brushing the hair from Emily's face. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." As the first rays of dawn broke through the window, the house seemed to breathe again. The warmth returned, the shadows banished. But Clara knew the danger wasn't gone. Not entirely. She glanced at the back door, now bolted shut, and made a silent vow. Whatever it took, she would protect her daughter. She would never let them in again. And as the Christmas lights flickered softly, casting their warm glow, Clara held Emily close, determined to keep the darkness at bay. For now they were safe. But she would never forget the cost of a broken promise.